Chapter 2266. Beating. A half-deified Han Sun stood on the Lotus Mountain, watching with great delight as the blood Kirin entered the fray. Han Sun guessed that the creature had finished consuming the black Kirin, because it was now half-deified. On top of that, it was still inside the white bone hell. The ferocity of its attack sent Edward and Ice Blue Night King reeling back. After mere seconds had passed, the blood Kirin had already torn two King-class Ice Blue Knights to shreds. Joy sparked in Han Sen's chest as he saw the wretchedly wild face of the creature. "You guys hold off this beast. I will go after Han Sun," Edward shouted. He rushed across the battlefield, headed for the Lotus Mountain with the intent of catching Han Sun once and for all. The blood Kirin was in a killing frenzy, and it paid no attention to guarding its flanks. It pressed the attack against Ice Blue Night King, without sparing a glance at Edward. Han Sun felt depressed. This thing's intelligence needs to be increased. Although Fox Queen had whipped Edward, and injured him badly in the process, his half-deified body wasn't to be underestimated. He circled the battle, and arrived in front of Han Sun in moments. Han Sun knew that trying to outrun the man with simple speed would be impossible. Han Sun slapped the blood scorpion jade drum at his waist, sending a burst of scary sonic power toward Edward's forehead. The power flew out like a barrage of toxic needles. Edward grunted dismissively, and his whole body turned to a golden color. The blood scorpion's toxic needles struck the gold body, and failed to puncture it. Edward's golden form shone like a sun, showering the entire Lotus Mountain in golden light. Han Sun suddenly felt incredibly heavy, as if he was now shouldering the weight of a mountain. He couldn't move much at all. Han Sun knew that he was struggling under the power of that special gold god light. After dukes became kings, their elemental prowess increased dramatically. They could use their powers to blanket the land around them, laying claim to a large area. Edward's power was a heavy burden of suppression. It was a little similar to Ice Blue Night King's deep blue power. Edward didn't hesitate. He reached out to grab the currently suppressed Han Senator. Han Sun tried to fight it off, but the king-class suppression of the area was far too strong to compete with. Plus, Edward was half-deified. Although Han Sen's elemental prowess was very good for his level, it didn't have enough raw strength to counter this attack. He couldn't beat the suppressing force that was coming down on him. Edward's hand had almost reached Han Sen's neck when suddenly, Han Sen's hand lifted a small bird's nest. In his other hand, he raised a big army spear, and thrust it toward Edward's chest. Edward was shocked. He hadn't expected Han Sun to brush off his king-class area-off effect technique. They were too close together for Edward to block Han Sen's, but Edward didn't hesitate. He ignored Han Sen's strike, and continued reaching out to grab his prey by the throat. Han Sun was just a duke. Even if his weapon was deified, it wouldn't do too much damage to Edward's half-deified body. If he was able to catch Han Sun at the same time, Edward had no qualm with accepting the strike. At the moment Edward's fingers closed around Han Sen's neck, the Thunder God spike was plunged into Edward's armor. The armor stopped the Thunder God spike dead, with only an inch of the weapon's tip embedding itself in Edward's breastplate. But the Thunder God spike's silver lightning completely ignored the defense offered by that armor. When it discharged, it sent a current of electricity directly into Edward's body. Edward shook as the power ran through him, and his electrified body was sent flying away. Dong! Han Sun struck the blood scorpion jade drum again. Edward was still being ravaged by the silver lightning, and he couldn't gather his wits fast enough to summon power and repel the sonic attack. That sonic force was driven right into his forehead. Arg! Even for a half-deified elite, hearing the blood scorpion jade drum felt like being stabbed in the head. Edward couldn't help but let out a shrill cry. Han Sun put the bird's nest on his head as he continued to pound the drum. He had no intention of remaining idle though. He teleported directly in front of Edward, and used his Thunder God spike to strike at Edward once more. Half-deified warriors deserved their reputation, and despite the dizziness and fierce pain, Edward tried to gather up power to block Han Sen's next attack. The Thunder God spike's power wasn't very destructive, but the lightning energy it released could bypass any form of defense. The lightning surged into every single cell of Edward's body. Edward shook under the force, But Han Sun didn't have enough strength to use more than a tiny fraction of the Thunder God Spike's true power. Edward had only been numbed a little. If the Thunder God Spike was used by someone half-deified, a single hit would have left Edward shaking nonstop for an entire day. The Blood Scorpion Jade Drum's sonic power swept into Edward in a continuous stream, but Edward was holding strong against the numbness induced by the lightning. He raised his shield again, and the sonic attacks began bouncing off of him. I'm too weak. If I was stronger, the silver lightning would have kept Edward from gathering enough power to resist, Han Sun thought to himself. He kept moving though. Instead of thrusting with his Thunder God Spike, he resorted to beating Edward with it like some rod. All that electricity had Edward shaking on the ground, like he was experiencing a seizure. He was like a normal person being struck by a stun rod. Ice Blue Night King and the others, who were still in the midst of combat with the Blood Kirin, were frozen. The half-deified Edward was curled on the ground as Han Sun beat the pulp out of him. It was difficult to imagine. They knew the extent of Edward's strength, and a duke should have had no hope of repelling the golden god light. Han Sun didn't seem hindered at all as he pounded Edward. Edward's defenses couldn't withstand the lightning power emitted by the rod, and the man screamed continually and frothed at the mouth. It was too frightening to watch. What? You won't treat me with respect unless I unleash my power. Han Sun kept hitting Edward, wondering how he might kill the man. The lightning could bypass an opponent's defenses, but it couldn't actually kill anyone. And Han Sun couldn't do the job himself. He was too weak to break the man's armor, so he couldn't kill Edward with his strength alone. The Blood Kirin, Han Sun thought. Then he beckoned for the monster. The Blood Kirin was still chasing the others, but Ice Blue Night King and his group didn't dare to engage the beast. They were keeping it busy by baiting it back and forth. The Blood Kirin's intelligence was low. They lured it left and right, to and fro, and it hadn't managed to kill any of them. At the sound of Han Sun's voice, though, the beast turned to look at him. When it saw Han Sun slamming his fists into Edward, a light came into its eyes. It ran over, chomped down on Edward's head, and catcha. The armor was destroyed. Edward's head was bitten off. Severed arteries in the man's neck sprayed blood all over the Blood Kirin. It swallowed the head in a single gulp. The sight made Ice Blue Night King and the others shiver in fear and anger. Chapter 2267 My opponent Ivan. TA student Han Sun jumped onto the Blood Kirin's back. Then, the Blood Kirin roared and flew towards Ice Blue Night King and the others. Ignore those other guys and kill him first, Han Sun instructed, thrusting his Thunder God Spike toward Ice Blue Night King. Instead of answering, the Blood Kirin simply kept roaring as it headed for Han Sun's target. Charge! Ice Blue Night King called to the Ice Blue Knights as he swept his greatsword at the Blood Kirin. The Blood Kirin paid no mind to the other knights though. The knights had previously exploited the Blood Kirin's stupidity to land a few blows, but now that the creature was following Han Sun's commands, they found themselves having to give the creature an even wider berth. Han Sun, if you keep this up, you will never be allowed back into the Ice Blue Knights. Ice Blue Night King shouted, watching an Ice Blue Knight get torn to shreds by the Blood Kirin. I've already quit the Ice Blue Knights. Do you really think I plan to return after all this? When you guys decided to fight with me, you should have said your prayers and readied yourselves for death. Han Sun shot back. Ice Blue Night King did not speak again. He had treated Han Sun as Isha's student. He thought of Han Sun as a junior, and he had never thought he would have to take the young man as an enemy. Even though Han Sun had betrayed the knights, Ice Blue Night King only wanted to teach him a lesson as a senior knight. He wanted to grab Han Sun, take the slate, then haul Han Sun back to his rightful place in the knights. It was only now that Ice Blue Night King realized he had been wrong about Han Sun since the beginning. He never considered Han Sun as an equal, and it never crossed his mind that Han Sun would see him as an opponent or a competitor. Han Sun wasn't a junior who required protection or could be ordered around. Han Sun was a mighty elite who had exactly what it took to survive and thrive in that cruel world. He was holding his own despite the many powerful enemies that wanted him dead. Ice Blue Night King's realization might have come too late. If he had considered Han Sun as a real threat in the beginning, he wouldn't have given Han Sun any chance to escape the base. He would have taken Han Sun down as soon as possible, and he wouldn't have chased after Han Sun alone when he first made his escape. The Blood Kirin chased the group back to the hellish skeletal gate, killing everyone but Ice Blue Night King, Crime, and one other Ice Blue Knight along the way. Han Sun and the Blood Kirin didn't dare draw too close to the gate though. Han Sun allowed the 3 survivors to escape. Then he went back to the Lotus Mountain where the Blood Kirin lived. I was foolish. I should have treated him like a genuine opponent. Ice Blue Night King stared at Han Sun, who was riding away atop the Blood Kirin. His face was expressionless, showing no hint of anger or sadness. From that moment on, Ice Blue Night King was going to treat Han Sun like a genuine opponent. To go against a strong opponent though, he'd need more than the few students he had. Crime looked grim. Is that guy really Isha's student? He seems scarier than Isha. I fear we may have underestimated him. You cannot blame us for that. Who would have assumed that a Marquise could pose such a threat? Asked the other Ice Blue Knight, whose name was Harder. Harder was feeling rather conflicted at that moment. He and Edward had been very close, so he knew just how terrifying the man had been. Although Edward was just a hybrid extreme king, and his attack power wasn't too strong when compared to the rest, his powers of observation and his movements were splendid. Harder again envisioned Edward lying helpless under Han Sen's attack, and the Ice Blue Knight struggled to find words to describe what that horrible sight had done to him. Although Han Sun was just a duke, no one dared treat him as a duke anymore. Fox Queen met Ice Blue Night King and the other 2 at the gate. She frowned and said, "Where are the others?" Ice Blue Night King told her what had happened. He spoke plainly and without exaggeration, describing Han Sun and the Blood Kirin's power. And he did not hide the fact that his group had well and truly failed. Interesting. Very interesting. The Blood Kirin became half-deified that quickly? And Han Sun was riding it in battle? Fox Queen squinted her eyes. She didn't blame Ice Blue Night King. After a moment she said, "You guys can stay here to aid Mr. White in breaking the restrictions of this place. When I break the chains binding me here, I can go and take him down myself." Back in the Blood Kirin's valley, Han Sun allowed Bauer and the others to leave Destiny's Tower and relax for a bit. He also wanted to discuss their game plan for the coming conflict. Han Sun had used the Blood Kirin's power to defeat Ice Blue Night King and the others for the time being, but he didn't think they were safe yet. And that made him even more worried. Edward and the others had been able to find the palace and bend the restrictions to gain entry. That meant one of them understood the structure of the palace, at least to some degree. Fox Queen hadn't sent Mr. White after them, and that was probably because Mr. White knew the most about the palace's composition. If he was able to break Fox Queen's restrictions, then Han Sun would be in big trouble. Han Sun stood no chance of defeating an unhampered deified elite, even if he had all sorts of deified items to use against her. And now, Han Sun was stuck in the Whitebone Hell. The palace was his only means of escape. Unless he wanted to stay there forever, he would have to leave through the skeletal gate. But the Blood Kirin is only half deified. If I could make it deified, it would be easy to ride it out and slaughter whatever got in our way, Han Sun thought to himself. Han Sun's team talked for half the day, but they didn't come up with anything that seemed really promising. Han Sun decided to focus his efforts on absorbing all the ghost bone power he could. He hoped to get the story of genes to Duke class. The more power he had, the better his chances of survival would become. Even if Fox Queen really does manage to escape, she won't kill me if she can't find what she wants. That means I might still have a chance. As Han Sun rested, he fidgeted with the stone plate. He kept thinking about how things might play out. The Blood Kirin and Han Sun were very comfortable with each other by this point, but only Han Sun could get close to the beast. The creature's presence was too menacing. It looked at everyone else like slabs of meat. The Blood Kirin looked likely to jump forward and gobble them up at any second. Han Sun kept practicing with the story of genes. A month went by, and the story of genes was progressing quite well. It was still a long way away from becoming Duke though. Suddenly, the whole of Whitebone Hell began to shake, and Han Sun heard Fox Queen's voice coming through the hellish skeletal gate. "My good little brother, your big sister is coming to find you." Fox Queen stood in front of the gate, and the metal shackles were still visible on her neck, arms, and ankles. The metal chains that connected to the shackles, however, were gone. Mr. White, Ice Blue Night King, Crime, and Harder stood behind Fox Queen. It was like they were now her people. Fox Queen's aura spread across the Whitebone Hell, searching for Han Senator, but suddenly, two shadows appeared from the mountains. It was Han Sun and the Blood Kirin. That surprised her. She had expected Han Sun to try to escape, not come looking for her. Chapter 2268 Holy Monument. My good little brother. Are you really that naive? Surely you don't think that the Blood Kirin's power is sufficient to challenge someone like me? Fox Queen smiled at Han Sun and the Blood Kirin as she stood before the mountain. Big sis, you're far too suspicious. Have you forgotten about the close bond between us? Why would I ever want to attack my big sister? When I realized that you'd been freed, I wanted to come and celebrate the occasion with you. I just thought I would bring along the Blood Kirin, Han Sun said. If you've come here to celebrate with your big sister, you should have brought her a gift, isn't that correct? Otherwise, your big sister would be made rather angry, Fox Queen said, maintaining her smarmy smile. Han Sun knew what gift Fox Queen was referring to. He moved without hesitation, pulling out the item and holding it up. Of course, this is your big day. As a little brother, I want to give you the best gift I can. Fox Queen looked at the item in Han Sen's hand, and then she looked at Mr. White and asked, "What do you guys think of the gift my little brother is offering?" "We have no idea. Only Edward knew what the item was," Mr. White confessed, looking slightly ill. Fox Queen held out her hand, and Han Sun placed the item in her palm. Fox Queen looked at the crystal tablet carefully, but there did not appear to be anything special about it. "Is this really the item you retrieved from Ghostbone Town?" Fox Queen directed a piercing stare at Han Sr., "The one and only," Han Sun assured her. Fox Queen gave Mr. White the stone tablet. "Mr. White, what do you make of it?" After a brief moment of thought, Mr. White said, "I don't know what exactly is special about this item, but I can tell you that it is very old. It must be truly ancient, in fact. Its age alone makes it interesting." Mr. White was making it clear to Fox Queen that he didn't know if the tablet was the same item that Han Sun had taken from Ghostbone Town. It was too old to be a forgery, though. Han Sun thought to himself, "Of course it is old. I went back to the Alliance and took it from a crystallizer ruin." Fox Queen smiled and looked at Han Sr., "Since you've been so nice to your big sister, come and walk alongside me." "Of course, my big sister." Han Sun smiled. Fox Queen found it suspicious that Han Sun would give up his prize so easily, and she couldn't be certain if the tablet was genuine. She had to take Han Sun with her to the Holy Monument. Then they could find out whether or not it was the real deal. Fox Queen cast a spell, and one of her cords of power tethered Han Sun and the Blood Kirin to her. She smiled and said, "Please don't blame me for this precaution. You have been misbehaving recently, my little brother, so I'm afraid I have no choice." "Oh, I'm so sorry that I've made you worry, big sister." Han Sun smiled coldly. "What was that bird's nest that I saw you use earlier?" Fox Queen looked Han Sun over, but she saw no sign of the bird's nest. The item had melted her cord of power, which made quite an impression on her. "I hid it someplace in the Whitebone Hell. If you can find it, I can give it to you as a gift." Han Sun smiled. Fox Queen wasn't in the mood to look. She couldn't find the bird's nest when she searched Han Sun's body, but that was fine by her. Hiding the nest in the Whitebone Hell was like lobbing it into her personal warehouse. She would have plenty of time to seek it out later. Fox Queen led Han Sun and the others out of the Whitebone Hell and locked the hellish skeletal gate behind them. Then she ripped down the palace's gate, and the group left the palace. "It has been so long since I've had the chance to breathe fresh air." Fox Queen stood under the sky, looking out at the stars as she spoke. Han Sun and Mr. White stood together, but they didn't speak. Mr. White and Ice Blue Night King weren't in any better of a situation than Han Senator. Fox Queen's temperament changed with the wind, and there was no telling who she might be ready to kill 1 hour from then. "Let's go. We will head for the Holy Monument. Let's see what the sacred leader chose to leave behind," Fox Queen said, looking at Mr. White. "Crime, you lead the way," Mr. White ordered. "Sir, Crime said, his face pale. What are you thinking? Right now, surviving is our priority. Mr. White gave a wry smile. Mr. White, you are very smart. Don't worry though, I do not like killing. Once I have collected the legacy items of the sacred leader, you will all be allowed to return home safe and sound. Fox Queen smiled. Ice Blue Night King and the others were too smart to believe Fox Queen's promise to them, but they were in no position to gainsay her decisions. They had to do as Fox Queen told them. Even if they didn't tell Fox Queen the monument's location, she would find it at some point anyway. Withholding the information would only delay the inevitable. Harder and Ice Blue Night King both looked at Mr. White. It had taken them a second to realize that Mr. White was the only one who knew where the monument was. Harder thought quickly as he walked. Amidst the people there, he was the only one who knew that Han's son had stolen a stone tablet from Ghost Bone Town. The crystal stone that Han's son had presented to Fox Queen wasn't the same item he had taken. Han's son has guts, I'll give him that. He has actually dared to present a fake relic to Fox Queen. It is fake though. They are sure to find that out once we reach the holy monument. And when that happens, I wonder what he is planning to do. Has he found a way to escape? Harder looked at Han's senator. If Han's son behaved strangely, Harder would notice. Han's son's chances of running away didn't seem very good. Fox Queen had a cord of power tied around him and the blood Kirin, and she was being very careful to keep an eye on him. There was no way he could escape. With crime leading, they quickly traveled through the mountains and entered a primal forest. Many xenogenics wandered across their path, but Ice Blue Night King and crime were able to cut them all down quickly. None of their foes were too strong. They walked through the primal forest for 4 days. Eventually, Mr. White pointed forward and spoke. Here it is. Everyone looked where Mr. White was pointing. They all looked shocked, and even Han's son furrowed his eyebrows in suspicion. This is the holy monument. Fox Queen frowned at the sight. Mr. White was indicating an old tree. The tree was very thick. It would require 4 people holding hands to encircle it. But other than that, it looked quite ordinary. Not to mention the fact that it was dead. There was not a single leaf on it, and many of its branches were broken. It stood alone in a small clearing in the forest. In a primal forest like the one they were standing in, such trees must have been a dime a dozen. Mr. White told them it was a holy monument, but the unimpressive sight before them made it difficult to believe his claim. Han's son used his Dongxian aura to scan the tree, and he could discern nothing special about it. The sacred leader didn't want to put his treasure somewhere obvious. If you look a little closer, though, you are sure to see the truth of this amazing old tree, Mr. White said quietly. Chapter 2269 Fruit Tree. Fox Queen moved closer to get a better look at the tree, but she soon started to frown. Is there something inside the tree? Is the holy monument inside the tree? Mr. White stepped forward in alarm. Please do not touch it. Why? Fox Queen and Han's son both looked at Mr. White. Mr. White said, this tree is very sturdy, and it has been infused with a special magnetic force that repels all xenogenics. Inside the trunk, however, is a shatter space crystal. Shatter space crystal? One of Fox Queen's eyebrows rose. Yes, Mr. White confirmed gravely. Hansen asked, what is a shatter space crystal? It is a material that is used to construct teleportation devices, Harder explained. Using one of those crystals in a device will greatly extend the device's range. It is the best known material to use when crafting teleportation devices. That means there is a teleportation device inside that tree? We can use it to visit the holy monument? Hansen asked, starting to catch on. That's the theory, Mr. White nodded. But you must open the tree to gain access to the teleporter that is located inside it. With our big sister's power, tearing down the tree to reveal the crystal should be easy, shouldn't it? Hansen questioned. It's not that simple, Fox Queen replied in a distracted tone. Shatter space crystals are unparalleled in their use for teleportation technology, but they are also very fragile. And the tree and the shatter space crystal have been integrated very carefully. They are one with each other. If we use force to bring down the tree, the shatter space crystal on the inside will be broken. That would completely ruin the device on the inside. It's fortunate that you have the key then. You simply need to use the key to open the tree's door, Mr. White said. Han-sun felt worry descend on him. He hadn't known that the stone tablet would be the key required to open that device. The piece of crystal he had given Fox Queen was little more than the makeshift paperweight. It was going to be impossible for her to gain access to that device. How do we use it? Fox Queen looked at the brick in her hands, then back at Mr. White. If our theory is correct, then there must be a keyhole. Mr. White looked hesitant as he spoke. But there is no hole in the tree's surface that is this big. Fox Queen looked at Han-sun, the suspicion clearly visible in her eyes. She already thought that Han-sun had given her a fake. I really did take that item from Ghostbone Town. Keep looking, you should be able to use it. Han-sun pretended to observe the tree, feigning innocence. Over there. Han-sun suddenly pointed to the crown of the tall tree, looking very excited. Fox Queen and the others looked at where Han-sun was pointing, but they couldn't see anything special. As the others were distracted, Han-sun leaped back onto the blood Kirin. A bird's nest appeared in his hand, and he held the nest out to protect himself from Fox Queen's attacks. The blood Kirin roared and streaked toward the tree. Fox Queen was the quickest to react. She threw her hands forward, sending countless cords of power chasing after Senator Han-sun put his hand into the concave part of the bird's nest, and suddenly it began to grow larger. It became a giant shield that stopped the pursuing cords of power. As the blood Kirin arrived at the old tree, Han-sun brought out the real stone plate. He shoved it into a moon-shaped indent in the surface of the tree, and the stone plate slotted into it perfectly. Catcha! The old tree suddenly broke open to reveal a large frame contained within the trunk. A shining orb of twisted space hung in the center of the frame, filled with spiraling fractalic patterns. It was so bright that it was barely visible through the light. The blood Kirin carried Han-sun into the orb. Space seemed to fold around them for an instant, and then they vanished. Fox Queen leaped after them. The dimensions of space were twisted, and she too disappeared with Senator Ice Blue Night King gritted his teeth and ran inside as well. Mr. White, Crime, and Harder also decided to follow. They didn't want to give up on claiming the sacred leader's legacy here. After everything they had been through, Han-sun set the bird's nest atop his head. When the space around him untwisted and deposited him back in reality, he found himself standing in a palace. The stone tablet was back in his hands. He quickly activated his purple eye butterfly and looked around. He was standing in a jade stone palace. There were many strange statues around him, fashioned in the images of animals, gods, and demons of all kinds. The walls and the ceiling were covered in strange paintings. They didn't look like drawings or precise script, but they did seem to be symbols of some kind. Behind Han-sun, the teleporter began to shift again. Run! Han-sun shouted. It appeared as if someone else was coming. He nudged the blood Kirin, urging it to hurry toward the palace gate. The palace gate was open, and a white light was shining through it. It seemed like the light had been placed there intentionally to block any view of what lay beyond, and not even Han-sun's purple eye butterfly could pierce that veil. Han-sun was so desperate to get away from Fox Queen that he ignored the possibility of encountering traps. He and the blood Kirin raced through the light. The blood Kirin carried Han-sun through the palace's front gate, and both of them felt space twisting in the same manner it had with the teleporter. When Han-sun's vision returned, he found himself inside another palace. He was standing before its teleporter. It was different from the first palace though. This palace didn't have half as many statues or paintings. In the middle of the palace, however, there was a fruit tree. The fruit tree only stood about 2 meters high. Its body was like a plum tree, but it was wrought of twisted black steel. The branches seemed crooked and crudely made. The leaves on the tree were silver, and the fruit hung like egg-sized silver slices. Han-sun counted 8 silver slices on the tree. They were all of the same size, and they all looked silver white. At the bottom of each slice was a unique pattern that appeared to have been branded into it. Silver treasures? Han-sun had a closer look. Words were woven into the pattern. Is this tree man-made? Han-sun looked at the teleporter behind him. The teleporter remained silent and inactive, which made Han-sun feel uneasy. With Fox Queen's speed, she should have caught up with him by now. How was it possible that she was not there yet? When I traveled through the palace gate, did the light there send me someplace else? Han Sen thought to himself. Aside from that, he couldn't think of another reason why Fox Queen wouldn't have caught up with him. He was happy about this turn of events regardless of the reason though. Without her on his heels, he felt a lot safer. Han Sen decided to look at the silver treasure again. He hesitated for a moment, then put on his galactic lobster armor. He walked directly to the tree and pulled out his knife to cut down one of the silver treasures. The ghost teeth knife shrieked across the steel surface of the tree. Instead of severing the twig, the knife had only left a light mark upon it. The mark did produce some blood-like sap though. This tree is alive. Han Sen looked rather surprised. The sap welled with energy. Han Sen used his purple-eye butterfly to observe the silver treasure fruit tree. He quickly confirmed that it really was a living tree. It had been there for many years, growing from a small sapling to what it was now. With the purple-eye butterfly, Han Sen was able to observe a timeline that spanned 1 billion years. Chapter 2270 Silver Sicey. The steel twig was unexpectedly tough. It took Han Sen a long while to cut through it, so he could claim the silver fruit for himself. When he finally sawed through the twig, the silver fruit dropped from the tree. Han Sen reached out his hand to grab it. But the moment the silver sicey touched his hand, Han Sen's eyes widened. His face twisted, and his muscles trembled and shook. His blood surged through his veins like lightning, and his entire body turned to ice jade. He roared. He struggled to raise the hand that was holding the silver sicey, his other hand clutching his waist, as if he was about to have a hernia. Han Sen summoned all the power he could. His hair flew around like mad, and green veins bulged across his head. Patong! The silver sicey continued to fall to the ground, taking Han Sen's hand with it. Han Sen had to half kneel on the ground. What kind of fruit is this? It is so heavy. If I swallowed this, it would tear straight through my stomach. Han Sen stared at the fruit in disbelief. He wanted to get his hand out from under it, but it was pinning his hand down. He pulled away with all his might, but the fruit wouldn't budge. Han Sen took out his knife and hacked away at the silver fruit. The loud shrieking noise of metal on metal assaulted his ears, but the sicey remained completely undamaged. The fruit was harder than the tree it had come from. After a moment of thought, Han Sen decided to dig into the ground instead. The floor of the palace was also incredibly hard though. Han Sen's cuts only left light scrape marks behind. The blood Kirin used its own claws to help dig through the stone near Han Sen's hand. The creature actually managed to leave a few proper scratch marks, but whenever it pulled its claws away, the scratch marks would disappear. The blood Kirin kept digging, but the floor continued to miraculously recover. Han Sen's hand remained motionless under the silver sicey. Grab that fruit and lift it away. Han Sen barked to the blood Kirin when he realized that digging into the floor was a futile endeavor. The blood Kirin, upon hearing Han Sen, locked its jaws around the silver sicey. It yanked upward with all of its might, but the silver sicey remained still. What is this thing? Han Sen was frozen. It was just a fruit, but not even a half-deified being could move it. The sicey didn't even twitch. Even more strangely, Han Sen's hand hadn't been crushed. The sicey was keeping him pinned in place. But if the fruit was really as heavy as it seemed, his hand should have been crushed and broken. In truth, his hand was only suffering a bit of pressure. It definitely hadn't been injured. Just as Han Sen was about to use Purple-Eye Butterfly to take a look at the fruit, the teleporter rippled with movement. Someone was coming. Han Sen looked over as Mr. White and Crime emerged. Their presence made him frown. Although Crime was king class instead of half-deified, Han Sen had witnessed his talents in battle. He was no worse than the half-deified Edward, by Han Sen's estimation. Han Sen, what are you doing? Mr. White looked at Han Sen with interest. The blood Kirin interrupted his question with a roar. Then it leaped towards Mr. White and Crime. Its claws wielded a blood air, as they slashed as Mr. White like blades. Mr. White stepped forward like he was teleporting. He appeared right beside the blood Kirin, and pressed a hand against the creature's head. Mr. White's hand flashed with a strange symbol. That symbol sank into the scaled forehead of the blood Kirin like a brand. Boom! the blood Kirin's body suddenly became heavier, and the increased weight almost took the creature to its knees. The symbol glowed gently from the creature's forehead, and the blood Kirin seemed to struggle against the encumbrance. The blood Kirin roared and jumped towards Mr. White again, but this time, it was far slower. Mr. White moved with eerie grace, and every step looked like he was teleporting. His power was similar to Huang Fujing's. He was far stronger than her, of course. The blood Kirin continued to chase Mr. White, all the while roaring in rage. It was angry at being tricked, and even more furious that it was unable to bring harm to Mr. White. Mr. White had played it for a fool. The blood Kirin's intelligence really is quite low. Han Sun sighed. The beast had plenty of brawn, but it was severely lacking in the brains department. Mr. White lured the blood Kirin to a side hall, and Han Sun could do nothing to stop him. Meanwhile, Crime headed for the pinned-down Han Senator. He looked at Han Sun and said, "We have no grudge with you. Give me the stone plate, and we will leave. We will pretend we did not see you. Come and get it, if you have what it takes," Han Sun replied flatly. "You are strong, but regrettably, the fruit seems to be holding you in place quite easily. You can't escape as you are right now. How do you expect to fight me?" Crime drew his knife. They had paid the price of underestimating Han Sun before, but now, Crime considered him to be an equal opponent. Crime and Mr. White were not going to underestimate him anymore, because he was a duke. Even though Han Sen's hand was held firmly in place, which left him unable to run, Crime was still going to use all his power when he attacked. Crime's knife was very creepy, although it was only 1 foot long. It was made of black metal, and the blade was shorter than the handle. It looked like the blade had been broken. A ring protruded from the base of the handle, and a chain was attached firmly to the ring. The other end of the chain connected to Crime's strong arm. As Crime slashed toward him, Han Sun didn't speak. He simply tapped the bird's nest on his head, and it widened to shield Han Sen's entire body. The bird's nest caught Crime's strike and reflected it in complete silence. No sound was heard, and the nest remained perfectly intact. Crime was surprised. He gathered up all his power and slashed a few more times. Nothing he tried seemed to work, though. Han Sun wasn't worried that Crime would break the bird's nest. Even Fox Queen hadn't been able to damage that thing. There was no way Crime could do what she could not. It was a shame the bird's nest couldn't be used defensively. However, he was currently more frustrated by his inability to get the fruit off of his hand. Han Sun tried a few different powers, but nothing seemed to work. Aside from using his super god spirit body, he didn't seem to have many options. Suddenly, Mr. White's voice came from the side hall. "Han Sun, if things continue like this, none of us will benefit. Why don't we try to cooperate? What do you suggest?" Han Sun asked after a moment. "Make this blood Kirin stop firstly. At least then we might be able to talk," Mr. White said. "Okay." Han Sun called the blood Kirin back to his side. Mr. White also removed the mark he had placed upon the creature's forehead. "How about this? I'll help you escape, and in return, you'll give me the stone plate," Mr. White said while looking at Han Sr. Chapter 2271 Taking the Silver Sicey. "No. I will figure out how to get out of this by myself," Han Sun said coldly. Mr. White shook his head and smiled. "That is no ordinary fruit, as you should be able to feel. It has you locked in place with no hope of escape. Even the strength of the blood Kirin wasn't enough to free you. You know about this thing?" Han Sun frowned. Mr. White looked at the fruit tree and said, "This tree is known as the Silver Treasure Fruit Tree. It is one of the 3 treasure fruit trees. It is a deified plant xenogeneic. The legends say that all 3 treasure fruit trees are located in the sacred leader's own gardens, and those 3 are the only ones in existence. I cannot believe that we're standing right in front of one of them." After pausing, Mr. White went on to say, "The 3 treasure fruit trees I've been talking about are the bronze treasure fruit tree, the silver treasure fruit tree, and the gold treasure fruit tree. They each have their own unique powers. The only one that matters right now is this one, the silver treasure fruit tree. As you can see, it has silver slices that are capable of suppressing one's soul. They exert force directly on the soul, bypassing the body completely. Because your soul is being locked down, It doesn't matter if you use every ounce of strength you possess. Your body will not be able to throw off the suppression. This does not just apply to someone like you either. And that doesn't just apply to people of your power level, either. Even a deified being couldn't free themselves from that suppression. After saying all this, Mr. White smiled. Of course, this effect only activates once the silver fruit has been touched. A deified elite would have the sense not to make physical contact with them. This thing cannot be eaten? Han-san felt depressed. If he had known all of this sooner, he wouldn't have gone and picked up the silver fruit with his bare hands. Eaten. Mr. White looked as if he was going to burst out laughing. Unless you want your soul to be locked down forever, why would you ever think about eating one of those? Crime laughed too. You want to eat the silver fruit? I'm afraid I have to tell you that you are the only person in the entire universe who would think like that. Then what do the other fruits do? The bronze and gold ones? Han-san asked. Han-san didn't ask out of idle curiosity. If they had found the silver treasure fruit tree in this palace, then the others might be nearby. That doesn't matter. What matters is that you are currently suppressed by the silver Saisi. Without my help, you will be stuck here forever. The palaces here are all connected in one way or another. It is only a matter of time before Fox Queen finds you. Do you think she'll let you leave this place alive? Mr. White chuckled. Give me the stone plate, and we can explore this place together. I am only after one additional item. I will gladly share the rest. Realizing that he wouldn't be able to pry any more information about the bronze and gold fruits out of Mr. White, Han-san had to ask. Then what do you want? I can't tell you that. I will need first pick after we find the items. It will not be a great loss to you. And it is better than Fox Queen finding you and killing you. Isn't that right? Mr. White said. If that's your offer, then you guys can leave. There is no need for us to cooperate, Han-san said firmly. Mr. White frowned and said, Do you really think Fox Queen will spare you? The shape-shifting foxes are known to be capricious. She might have been nice to you at one point in time, but that won't stop her from killing you now. I know that, but I have my own plans. There is no need for you two to worry about it, Han-san replied confidently. Crime wished to say something, but Mr. White stopped him. Mr. White looked at Han-san and said, I am good when it comes to restriction and prediction skills. I can help you avoid many risks, and I can also find the sacred leader's treasure quickly. Even if you aren't afraid of Fox Queen, being stuck here won't do you any good. You will have no choice but to sit there and watch Fox Queen treat herself to all the spoils. We can cooperate, but I must have the stone plate. I'll offer you the same deal but in reverse. I get to choose what I want first. Han-san smiled. Mr. White went silent and smiled. Okay, I will accept your terms. Han-san was shocked. He didn't expect Mr. White to agree so quickly. Crime was shocked as well, and he said, Mr. White, how could you? It's okay. Without the stone plate, we cannot access the real treasure, anyway. Mr. White waved his hand. If you guys wish to cooperate, can you tell me how to get rid of this silver fruit? Han-san asked, looking at Mr. White. It is not difficult. The silver fruit has the power to suppress souls. If it cannot feel your soul, then its suppressing power will be lifted. I have a Geno art that can seal a soul. I will need to seal your soul so that the fruit cannot feel you. If we do this, you will be free from it, Mr. White said. I see. The more I struggle, the harder it becomes to get out, Han-san realized. If you understand, then we should not waste any more time. We need to get to the treasure before Fox Queen does. I will use the sealing soul technique to get you out of here, Mr. White said as he began walking forward to Han Sr. Hang on. Han-san held up a hand. The blood Kirin slid in front of Han-san and presented its teeth to Mr. White. Don't worry, I'm not that treacherous. If I said we will cooperate, I won't betray my own words and do something bad to you, Mr. White said. Mr. White, you worry too much. I trust you, but I don't actually need your help. Han-san suddenly stood up. He lifted his hand easily, picking up the Saisi and holding it before his eyes. Mr. White and Crime looked at Han-san in shock, finding it difficult to believe their eyes. Han-san was ignoring the silver Saisi's soul-suppressing power completely. They found that hard to believe. Hansen didn't know exactly what the silver sicey did, but learning that the fruit suppressed a person's soul had changed things. Avoiding the soul-suppressing effects of the silver sicey was actually quite easy for Hans Senator. The Sea of Soul was different from the will of most ordinary creatures. If a creature lost their will, it would be as if they were dead. Their control over their body would be lost. Hans Sun would be affected similarly if his Sea of Soul shut down. But ordinary people only had one soul. Hansen's Sea of Soul, however, had many spirits and beast souls. Hans Sun reduced his soul and let a beast soul power rise to the surface. The silver sicey then suppressed the beast soul instead of Hans Senator. His soul immediately became light and buoyant. We said half and half. Are you interested in the silver siceys? Hans Sun asked casually, playing with the silver sicey as he spoke. I could have sealed your soul to free you, but your body would have shut down. I cannot touch the silver fruit myself. Mr. White shook his head. If you don't want these, then I will take them with me, Hans Sun stated happily. He swung his knife to cut down the other 7 silver fruits. With the help of the blood Kirin, he cut down the other 7 siceys with ease. He pocketed all of them. Mr. White and Crime were still frowning in consternation, which made it clear that they didn't understand how Hans Sun had done what he had. They looked at each other, realizing that they were equally confused. They grew even more suspicious of Hans Sr. Chapter 2272 Statue creatures in the Geno universe only had one soul, but Hansen's Sea of Soul held many beast souls. Since each silver sicey could only freeze one soul at a time, Hans Sun used 8 beast souls to neutralize the siceys. Hans Sun played with a silver sicey in his hand and stroked the blood Kirin's head. He looked at Mr. White and said, "Which way should we head now?" Mr. White went silent for a moment. I don't know what these palaces are made of, but not even Fox Queen could force one open. We have to travel around the palaces using their installed teleporters. Each palace seems to possess 4 teleporters. The front gate and each of the side halls have a teleporter. The back hall has one too. That means every palace has 4 exits. What we don't know is how many palaces there are. I think there might be a way to find the right path to the leader's hidden stash, though. Well, you're very good when it comes to calculations and restrictions, Mr. White. You must have the answer. Hans Sun smiled. I have a few ideas, but I cannot be certain my assumptions are correct. We can give them a try, however, Mr. White said. Then he turned to the back hall. Crime followed Mr. White, and Hans Sun and the Kirin brought up the rear. Just as Mr. White had explained, the place was practically a maze. Hans Sun wasn't very good with these sorts of puzzles, and it would have been very difficult for Hans Sun to find the sacred leader's treasure by himself. If he walked around aimlessly, he would probably never find the treasure. And if he bumped into Fox Queen, that one encounter could be the end of him. Mr. White teleported out via the back hall. When Hans Sun stepped out of the teleporter on the other side, he found himself in a big hall. The hall was just like the one Hans Sun had come from. There were many statues and paintings there. Mr. White made a calculation, and he went to the side hall's teleporter. Hans Sun wondered just how many palaces there were. This maze was far too complicated for him to navigate by himself. Mr. White made a calculation every single time they reached a new palace. It took them 4 hours to move through 100 palaces, and they still hadn't reached the end. How long is it going to take for us to reach the treasure? Hansen couldn't help but ask. Crime snorted in annoyance and said, Do you think calculating the right route is easy? If it wasn't for Mr. White leading us down the correct road, we would be teleporting into the wrong palaces and exposing ourselves to a great deal of danger. It wouldn't simply be a long trip at that point. We would struggle to survive whatever trials those other palaces threw at us. I wasn't complaining. I was just wondering how long it will take for us to get to where the treasure is hidden, Hans Sun said in exasperation. Mr. White laughed and said, If I'm guessing correctly, we'll be reaching the first checkpoint soon. What does that mean? Hans Sun asked. This was the first he'd heard about a checkpoint. After thinking briefly, Mr. White said, Even with us going down the correct road, there will be a few defensive systems that we'll have to bypass. For a treasure like this, There will be multiple protective measures in place. Our path is correct, yes, but we must also open the mini-locked doors to gain entry. I estimate that there will be 4 to 7 of them. I don't know exactly what form these checkpoints will take, of course. The defensive systems will be a touch more threatening than actual locked doors. We have to tread carefully. After saying all that, Mr. White returned his focus to the path ahead. Han Sen followed the man silently. After going through another 3 palaces, Mr. White arrived at a palace's main gate. It was there that he told Han Sen, "If I'm correct, the next palace will be the first checkpoint of this maze. You are going to have to be a little bit more careful." After that, Mr. White traveled through the light. Crime followed him as well. The bird's nest was still sitting on Han Sen's head, and he also summoned the gold demon bug king by Sima before walking through the light. Just like before, Han Sen appeared in a palace after teleporting. This palace looked far different from the other 100 palaces they had visited, though. This palace was circular, and the roof was shaped like a shield. A giant statue stood at the center of the hall, looking like some massive god that was clad in protective armor. Its head almost touched the roof above. Even though it was just a statue, the mere sight of it was terrifying. Looking at it made the observer want to submit to this deific figure, as if he was the center of the entire universe. Is this a statue of the sacred leader? Han Sen wondered as he observed the statue. Fox Queen had told him that the sacred leader always wore armor, and no one knew for sure whether it was a man or a woman. Mr. White and Crime had stepped out of the teleporter, but they did not go forward. When Han Sen and the Blood Kirin caught up with them, Mr. White said, "Although it looks safe, we still need to exercise caution. The correct exit here is the front gate. We will have to walk past the statue." Mr. White stepped towards the statue, but Crime quickly ran in front of him. "I will ensure the path is safe for you first." Han Sen really admired Crime. There were not many people left in that day and age that could remain so loyal and committed. Han Sen followed Mr. White, while Crime led the way from ahead. As they approached the statue's eyes suddenly lit up. The eyes gleamed like lanterns, showering the entire statue with light. Han Sen's group was suddenly standing in a spotlight. But while the light was bright, it didn't seem to be destructive. "Hello, children. Welcome to my treasury," the statue boomed. Han Sen jumped slightly. "Don't be afraid. This statue is only an extension of my will. It is not really me." The statue then went on to say, "If you've made it this far, then that means I am already dead. The items here are now useless for me. I can give them to you, but first you must pass a test. Only those that successfully pass the test will be allowed to claim my treasures. Anyone who fails, even if they are a deified being, will not be permitted to take so much as a single grain of sand." "What test?" Crime asked. The statue's voice was robotic. There were no emotional fluctuations in its tone, and it was impossible to guess its gender. It said, "This test is very simple. If you can break this, you will pass the test." After that, the statue moved. It reached out its hand and bent lower. It put an item in front of the group, then returned to its original position. The statue's eyes started to dim, and its appearance reverted to that of an ordinary statue. Han Sen looked at the item the statue had placed in front of them. It was a 40-centimeter long rock. It didn't really look special in any way, and it was made from green stone. Crime tried talking to the statue again, but the statue didn't respond to his questions. "Stop asking. It only has pre-programmed responses. Now that he is gone, there is nothing special about the statue," Mr. White said. Chapter 2273 Secret of a Stone. Crime approached the statue from the side, but it gave no reaction. So, Crime walked in front of the main hall's gate. Nothing weird happened there either. "Mr. White, if it isn't affecting us, should we just ignore it?" Han Sen looked at the stone. Mr. White shook his head. "The sacred leader left this item here on purpose. Maybe we will require it later on, and it could be difficult to come back to get it. And Fox Queen might take it if we leave it here." "You are right. But isn't it possible that the sacred leader is trying to play us? There might actually be a trap inside the stone," Han Sen said. Mr. White was momentarily silent. "That's possible, But I still think we should try. If the sacred leader wants to trick us, we might have to spring the trap in order to find the treasure. Let me give it a try, Crime said. He gathered up a surge of black light within his knife and swung it at the stone. Dong! A strike that could split space came down on the stone. It made a loud clanging sound, but the stone wasn't damaged. And there wasn't even a mark left behind. Crime's face became grim. The black light rose around his body and turned into a dark fire. His body looked as if it was wholly shielded by demons. The disturbing light danced around the hall. The dark light surrounded Han Sun, and he could not see or feel anything. It was like he was stuck in absolute darkness. Han Sun was shocked. He expanded the bird's nest to shield himself and the blood Kirin, in case Crime was preparing to attack them. Crime's area of affectability can muffle all 7 senses. It kind of resembles my Dongxian aura. While Han Sun was thinking, the darkness dissipated. Crime hadn't tried to attack them. When the room brightened again, he was standing beside the rock, looking defeated. He shook his head to Mr. White. He had tried his best, but he had been unable to break the stone. Mr. White, would you like to give it a try? Crime offered politely. No thanks. If not even your power was able to leave a mark on it, then this stone isn't something that can be opened by brute force, Mr. White said, then walked over to the stone to examine it. Han Sun put away his bird's nest. He walked closer to the stone and used his purple-eye butterfly to check the stone out. The history of the stone began to scroll back in Han Sun's vision, and after a minute or two, Han Sun jumped in surprise. The stone had originally been a bucket of viscous liquid, like cement. A demon-like creature was thrown into the liquid. No matter how much the demon struggled, it was unable to get out. The demon and that liquid were dumped into a mold. The liquid hardened over time until it became the stone in front of them. Han Sun raised his eyebrow at the stone. Mr. White looked at it for a while and frowned. This stone seems to have a will of its own. A very scary will at that. Perhaps that will is the key to breaking the stone open. Mr. White, what do you propose to do? Crime asked. Mr. White thought and said, let me use my soul sealing technique. I'll see if I am able to seal the will that's inside this thing. After that, Mr. White lowered his hand onto the stone, a strange symbol glowing on his palm. The symbol pressed against the stone, and the quiet stone was suddenly shaking like mad. A demonic, roaring noise came from it. It was terrifying. Under the glow of the symbol's light, the green stone started to bleed. The stone turned red. Pat! The symbol that Mr. White had branded onto the stone cracked and shattered, and then the stone returned to normal again. Mr. White was pale and trembling. Crime immediately moved over to put a hand on his shoulder and ask, Sir, are you okay? I am fine. Mr. White shook his head. The will inside that stone is so strong that not even my soul sealing technique worked. I'm afraid that this will belongs to a deified being. Upon hearing those words, Han Sun smiled and asked, Mr. White, if I am able to break this stone, can I have whatever is inside? We are cooperating, so we will have to share, of course, Crime said coldly. Mr. White, however, seemed to have thought of something. He smiled. If Han Sun can open it, then it would be a waste to leave it here. If you can open it, then the item inside is all yours. If it is useful, I hope you will use it to help us when the time demands it. Of course. Han Sun walked in front of the stone. He pulled out a silver saici and placed it on the stone. Then he stepped back. Han Sun used his mind to self-destruct the beast's soul he had linked to the saici. After the beast's soul was destroyed, the silver saici's suppressing power was directed into the stone instead. The stone started to shake again, and a scary roaring noise came from it. Drops of blood appeared on its surface. The silver saici was vibrating as well, but it did not fall off the top of the stone where Han Sun had placed it. It looks like the leader left the silver treasure fruit tree in the palace earlier on purpose. It was not a random placement. It was put there so that this stone could be broken. It is fortunate Han Sun brought the silver saicis with him. Otherwise, we'd have had no hope of opening this stone, Mr. White said. While they were talking, cracks began to spread across the stone's surface. The raging noises of its interior became even worse. Pang! Suddenly the stone exploded. Chunks of red rock flew in every direction. When the dust had settled, Han Sen walked over to the site of the explosion and picked up an item. It was a green crystal orb. There seemed to be smoke inside it, and the cloudy mass swirled with a magical allure. Han Sen could even see words flashing within the murk. "What is it?" Crime asked Han Sen, who was still holding the orb. Han Sen grinned and put the orb in his pocket. "Didn't Mr. White say that the contents of the stone would be mine?" Crime grunted and turned away from Han. Senator Mr. White smiled graciously. "Well, now you have it. Let's get moving." Han Sen doubted that Mr. White and Crime would keep their promises. They had come there prepared, and they were going to betray Han. Senator. He was very firm in his suspicions, so he had to claim as many rewards as he could for as long as he was able to. Han Sen followed behind Mr. White, examining the orb as he went. The orb was very misty, and the cloudiness almost hid the words inside it. When Han Sen looked closely, he was given a surprise. The content of the text was similar to the Blood Pulse Sutra. Chapter 2274 Blood Pulse Plunder. Han Sen was shocked. Ghostbone Town had a statue of the human emperor, and now he had found a Geno art that had a connection to the Blood Pulse Sutra. What was the relationship between the human emperor, the sacred leader, and Blood Legion? Han Sen couldn't figure it out, but reading the Geno art inside that red and misty orb made Han Sen happy. Since Han Sen had begun practicing the Blood Pulse Sutra, he had thought that it had little utility in the arts of combat. The most useful aspect of the Geno art was the mere fact that he could pass on his stronger genes to his descendants. But as he looked over the Geno art inside that orb, Han Sen could see another branch of possibilities shooting off from the Blood Pulse Sutra. The Geno art inside the orb was of the same type as Blood Pulse Sutra, but it wasn't identical. It was like a comparison between a flower and the individual leaves on the stem. They might have grown together, but they were different from each other. If the Blood Pulse Sutra was the flower, the Geno art inside the orb was a leaf. The duty of the flower was to bear fruit. The leaf, however, was for breathing. The metaphor might sound beautiful and gentle, but the Geno art was actually very cruel. The Geno art inside of the orb could steal the blood of other creatures. The skill could plunder the blood pulse of an opponent to provide nutrition for the user. The opponent would lose their own blood pulse power and end up as a dull creature, sapped of vitality. But to Han Sen, that savagery was merely a part of life. The Geno art functioned on the same rules of natural selection that govern the sanctuary. In the sanctuary, life was about plundering what other creatures offered in order to make oneself stronger. The Geno art was obviously a more direct approach to that goal. Han Sen thought of Dragon 8, whom he had once fought. If Han Sen wanted the man's gold dragon body, he would only have to use this new Geno art to steal the dragon's blood pulse. By doing that, Han Sen would steal the gold dragon body for himself. It was a very simple process. If that Geno art went public in the universe, Han Sen would be an enemy in the eyes of all. No race would allow their blood pulse to be stolen by another. Han Sen memorized the Geno art, which was called Blood Pulse Plunder. He swore to himself that he would never allow anyone else to learn of the Geno art's existence. If anyone learned that he possessed such a dangerous skill, no one would come near him. Because Han Sen had the Blood Pulse Sutra as a base, he didn't need to practice Blood Pulse Plunder. He could use it immediately, although his lack of experience with the skill would keep him from being very adept with it at first. Both of the skills were the same at their core. Pat. Han Sen memorized all of Blood Pulse Plunder, searing it into his memory. Then he crushed the green orb in his hands. Keeping it with him would be dangerous. It was best to destroy it now, and not leave any evidence behind. But when the green orb was crushed, the blood smoke ran into the tips of Han Sen's fingers. The smoke sank through his skin until it reached his blood vessels and blood. Han Sen tried to stop it, but nothing seemed to work. The Blood Pulse Sutra's power and the blood mist were one and the same. They melted together immediately, and they refused to separate. Blood Pulse Plunder started to run. The process was so smooth that Han Sen felt as if he had already practiced it 1,000,000 times. Whoever left this item behind was a very scary person. He seems to have known that the person who found the orb would destroy it. The red mist was prepared to aid a learner with the practice of Blood Pulse Plunder. Even if the person that found the orb hadn't learned the Blood Pulse Sutra, this would allow them to understand Blood Pulse plunder very quickly. Han Sen was shocked. Whoever designed the orb had clearly understood psychology quite well. After all those eons had passed, the person had still anticipated what Han Sen was going to do. But that means whoever prepared the orb didn't expect the person who collected the orb to know of the Blood Pulse Sutra already. In that case, this must not be an item that Blood Legion prepared for their own people. Maybe the Sacred Leader actually has nothing to do with Blood Legion, and he just acquired this through random happenstance? Han Sen continued to think to himself. Mr. White and Crime were still leading the way. Han Sen had the Blood Kirin follow behind him. Han Sen had been following Mr. White for a very long time now, and no danger seemed to cross their path. They walked through another 100 palaces, and then they arrived at a checkpoint. But this time, what they saw at the checkpoint froze them in place. There was a big hole in the middle of the circular palace. If that checkpoint was the same as the first one, there ought to have been a giant statue in its place. Mr. White's eyes widened. It looks like someone got here before us and decided to destroy the hall, Mr. White said. He rushed down to examine the hole, and Han Sen and Crime followed. They stood near him and looked down into the darkness. What they saw seemed to imply that it was a natural cavern formation. Pieces of floor and broken statue lay at the bottom of the cave. It was just as they thought. A statue had stood there, but it had been destroyed. Let me go down and take a closer look. Han Sen was curious. He didn't know who might have come there first and made such a mess. Han Sen went down to check out the cave carefully. He discovered that the cave had another 3 paths, which all led different directions. Crime and Mr. White ventured down as well. Mr. White looked at the pile of rubble that once formed the statue. The statue has been broken, and whatever gift it had for us is gone. I cannot be sure who took it though. The broken statue can no longer speak, either, so whatever message it had is lost to us. What do we do now? Should we stick with the plan, or check out where these tunnels might lead? Han Sen stared down one of the stone tunnels. Suddenly, the sound of an explosion erupted from the cave. The cave began to shake, as if there was a thunderstorm raging. It felt like their eardrums were going to break. Going into the caves is too risky. We should stick with the plan we have already established. If someone ventured this way before us, they would have to come back, even if they got the Sacred Leader's treasure. We can still stand a chance. Mr. White didn't look too cheery. He flew out of the cave. Han Sen used his purple-eye butterfly to examine the broken statue. He was unable to learn anything. He then looked down the tunnel, that seemed to be experiencing a thunderstorm. Hearing more thunder, Han Sen decided to go back with Mr. White. Perhaps it was because someone had already been there, but Mr. White calculated the next route much faster. It seemed as if he wanted to catch up with whoever was ahead of them. Over the next few palaces, Han Sen and the others were able to confirm that someone had come there before them. But Mr. White quickly discovered that the mystery man didn't seem to know the proper route. He had tried every single door of light, and he had made many mistakes. He had entered into some dangerous palaces before returning and taking the correct routes. This guy doesn't know the proper way to the treasure, but he keeps trying and trying. He has made it an impressive distance into this maze. That means the person is very strong, and he has been here for a very long time, Mr. White said with a frown. That should be impossible. Before we entered the portal in that tree, the door was locked. Without Han Sen's stone plate, how did he manage to gain access? Crime asked with suspicion. Mr. White merely shook his head. He didn't know. Han Sen didn't say anything, either, and he just followed Mr. White. Reaching the 3rd checkpoint took them an hour less than it had taken them to reach the 2nd checkpoint. Han Sen carefully entered the 3rd checkpoint and stopped dead. His eyes opened wide, and he almost screamed. Chapter 2275 13 Bridges. The 3rd checkpoint was completely different from the 2 prior checkpoints they had visited. Although it was a palace, too, it was much larger than the others. The floor of the palace wasn't covered in stone but water. It was a large lake, with many bridges running across it. The jade bridges were in the shape of a crescent moon, and there were 13 of them. They spanned the entirety of the palace, and each one seemed to connect to a separate teleporter on the opposite side of the lake. Each of the 13 bridges was made of a different type of jade. Stone statues stood along the railings of each bridge. Some of the statues seemed to depict devils, whereas others seemed to depict angels. Some were in the shape of vicious beasts, and others looked like gentle creatures. Han Sen was now looking out across a purple jade bridge. Its railings had a line of evil-looking stone statues, but that wasn't why Han Sen was observing it. Han Sen was looking at the highest point of the purple bridge, where there was a 10-meter-tall statue that looked like a devil. It was squatting in the middle of the bridge with its wings folded. The devil's eyes were looking down, as if they were scanning the area below for something to eat. Purple and blackish nails adorned its fingers, and they were long and sharp like talons. A woman was clutched in its hand, and the woman was quite familiar to Han Sr., Isha. Han Sen almost screamed out. The purple devil's stone hand gripped Isha firmly. Although her body was covered by its fingers, her face was clearly visible. She was very pale, and blood dripped from her mouth. It looked as if she was in a coma, and her hair had turned bone white. Han Sen recognized her even so, and he was certain of her identity. She was in horrible shape, but her face still looked exactly the same as he remembered it. She was still that almighty queen. No one else could ever look like she did. Why is Isha here? I thought she had been swallowed by under overbearing. Han Sen's heart jumped as he thought of something. Is this the palace that sits on under overbearing's back? Thinking of this possibility, Han Sen's heart started to pound like mad. No wonder the sacred leader wasn't afraid of people stealing his treasure. He invested a lot to secure his possessions. My queen! Han Sen shouted to Isha from across the bridge, hoping to wake her up. He could tell that she wasn't dead. Han Sen imbued his voice with a sonic wave, but the call prompted no reaction from her. Stop shouting. Even if a deified elite was shouting at her, she wouldn't be able to hear the call, Mr. White said. Ah, I see. Han Sen looked at Mr. White and bowed. Mr. White pointed at the jade bridge and said, These 13 bridges contain 13 different powers. Stepping onto a bridge locks you onto it. This must be the other test that was left behind by the sacred leader. We are going to have to choose the right bridge, if we are to go through this safely. What is the power of that bridge? Han Sen pointed at Isha's purple jade bridge. If I'm not mistaken, then the devil statues on the bridge are the legendary Hell Ghosts. The statue at the center must be Hell Ghost King. It represents hell power, Mr. White said, looking at the bridge carefully. Is hell power a death element power? Han Sen asked. Mr. White shook his head. Hell is where the dead go, according to the legends, but hell is not actually associated with the death element. It is another branch of space and time. You can understand it this way. Hell is another dimension that exists separately from our world. The axis of space and time is different there than in our world. So hell power comes from that difference in dimensional structure. It is not about death or darkness. Then how do we save her? Han Sen asked. Mr. White pursed his lips. Aside from forcing our way through, I cannot think of a way we can. Space and time are very mysterious elements that are extremely difficult to control. The legends say that the sacred leader mastered space and time powers. Knife was unlucky to select the jade bridge that is aligned with those energies. Han Sen frowned. If Isha had failed to force her way across the jade bridge, then that meant it would be even more difficult for him. After all, most of Han Sen's Geno arts were marquees. His fighting power wasn't as strong as Isha's half-deified abilities. Han Sen looked at Isha in the grip of the devil's hand, and when he looked closer, he saw that the devil's nails were actually digging into Isha's flesh. Ever so slowly, Isha continued to bleed. The blood ran across the statue's nails, and the tips of those nails were dyed red. If that continued, Isha wouldn't have much time left before she bled to death. The power of the Hell Bridge blocked Han Sen's connection with Isha, so he could not determine her life force. But he could see clearly that she didn't have much time left. Mr. White examined the 13 jade bridges, and then came back. He made a number of calculations. Han Sen thought he must have been trying to pick the jade bridge they could all cross safely. But quickly, Mr. White's face started to look gloomy. These 13 bridges are dead ends. They all have a scary power guarding them, so none of them can be crossed safely. Did the sacred leader not plan on letting anyone leave this place alive? No. There must be a way. Mr. White started to sweat. His fingers flashed with a symbol as he continued to make his calculations. Han Sen's eyes kept drifting over to the purple jade bridge. The purple-eye butterfly in his right eye spun, analyzing the structure of the purple jade bridge. Han Sen knew that Isha was very brave and sometimes arrogant, but she was never stupid. There was no way she would have decided to take the most difficult path. Han Sen thought Isha selected the Hell Bridge for a specific purpose. He just didn't know why she had failed. The purple-eye butterfly's four-flower purple pupil kept spinning, but not much could be gleaned. The purple jade bridge was wrapped up in some sort of power. Han Sen could see a very complicated substance chain around it, woven like a bird's nest. Han Sen couldn't understand this. He couldn't tell what sort of power it was. This is it. If we walk this bridge, we can make it through alive. Mr. White suddenly pointed at a jade bridge triumphantly. Han Sen looked at where Mr. White was pointing. He was indicating a jade bridge that was pitch black like ink. The bridge featured some crow-like bird statues. A giant bird statue stood in the middle of the bridge on a stone pillar, coldly overlooking the entire bridge. Chapter 2276 Hell Bridges. Mr. White explained. That bird is called the Death Crow. It leads the living through the cycle of death. It might seem like a dead end, but it is certainly a road we will be able to survive. This is the only bridge, out of the 13 of them, that can lead us safely to the other side. Going through life and death, yin and yang, the sacred leader was a very unique individual. If I hadn't researched the sacred leader's life and learned that he was reborn 9 times, I would have never have assumed that this was the correct path to take. You are very smart, Mr. White. Even the sacred leader's secrets are known to you, murmured a woman's voice. Han Sen and Mr. White both jerked in surprise. They turned around and saw Fox Queen approaching from behind. She had caught up to them very quickly. Mr. White's face looked glum. Clearly, he had never imagined that Fox Queen would catch up with them so quickly. If she didn't possess Mr. White's skill at calculating the correct path, it shouldn't have been possible for her to simply guess the correct way each and every time. There was no way she should have been able to follow them. Suddenly, Mr. White seemed to understand something. He looked down at his own body. Fox Queen laughed. You don't need to look. I left a spray on you, a specific scent that only a shape-shifting fox could follow. Fox Queen then ignored Mr. White, who was now looking green in the face. She stared at Han Sr. Good brother, we meet again. Did you miss your big sister? I sure missed you. Han Sen was gripping the bird's nest tightly as he started to step away. He was next to the Hell Bridge. He smiled at her. I missed you, big sister, but I would have been happy never seeing your face again. Fox Queen smiled and said, in that case, you must be disappointed. But since we're both already here, shouldn't you do something nice for your big sister, who cares so much about you? You want this, you mean? Han Sen pulled out the stone plate. He held it comfortably in one hand. Fox Queen's eyes brightened and she smiled. Little brother, you really do understand your big sister so very much. You are so cute. I really didn't want to brutally murder you. If you give it to your big sister, how about I keep you alive? Sure, but if you want it, you will have to chase me. If you catch me, I will give it to you, Han Sen said. Then he stepped onto the Hell Bridge with the blood Kirin. The muscles in Fox Queen's face tensed, but it was too late to stop Han Sen now. She flashed forward to the bridge, but she didn't have the guts to step on it. Mr. White was shocked, and he shouted, come back. You cannot go across the Hell Bridge. Mr. White knew he was wasting his breath though. The Hell Bridge meant hell power. And just like he had explained, it was a force from a different dimension. The moment Han Sen had stepped onto the bridge, he had entered a new dimension. No matter how loudly Mr. White shouted, he knew Han Sen couldn't see or hear him anymore. Mr. White, is there any way we can walk this bridge? Fox Queen was staring at Han Sen and the blood Kirin. Even deified elites might die there. Do you really think he can pull through? Mr. White had a wry smile. What a shame. Fox Queen looked at Han Sen and sighed. She didn't know if she was feeling remorse over the loss of Han's son himself, or the stone plate she coveted. "Mr. White, you can go on ahead," Fox Queen said distractedly, gesturing dismissively at him. Mr. White felt glum. He looked at Crime, then at the black bridge of life and death. Fox Queen watched Han's son for a while longer, then stepped onto the life and death bridge. When Han's son had stepped onto the hell bridge, his vision changed almost immediately. He had been able to see the end of the bridge clearly, but once he set foot on it, things changed. The bridge stretched on and on without an end in sight. Aside from the bridge and the lake, nothing else occupied his vision. Han's son couldn't see the other 12 bridges, or any of the teleporters. He couldn't see Fox Queen or Mr. White. It was as if the bridge was residing in a plane of existence, all on its own. Furthermore, the Hell Ghost statues on the bridge came alive, and they all looked like real devils. They hunched atop the rails, and their purple eyes glared at Han's son, as if they were going to swallow him alive. Their bodies were wreathed in purple fire, and there were so many of them that the whole bridge was wreathed in a chain of purple flames. It was an unsettling sight. Han's son held up the bird's nest as he went along. He looked as far down the bridge as he could, but he couldn't see the grand Hell Ghost statue and Isha in the middle anymore. Han's son gritted his teeth. He clutched the bird's nest tight and moved forward with the blood Kirin. Han's son believed Isha must have had a reason for selecting the Hell Bridge. Plus, Fox Queen was there. That meant Han's son didn't really have a choice in the matter. Walking across another bridge with her on his heels might have been more dangerous. Han's son moved slowly down the bridge, holding the bird's nest defensively. The Hell Ghosts atop the rail continued to stare at him, their eyes following him as he walked. They leered at Han's son and the blood Kirin. Perhaps they were scared of Han's son's bird's nest, and that was why they had decided not to follow. They simply stared at the pair. Han's son walked along the bridge for a while, but he soon started to feel poorly. Han's son had the bird's nest protecting his body, but he noticed that something ominous was still happening to him. The bird's nest is unable to block the Hell Bridge's power? Han's son looked down at his body, and also the body of the blood Kirin. He frowned. He and the blood Kirin were dyed purple. The further he walked, the deeper the color became across his skin. The blood Kirin had previously looked red, but not even it could block the dyeing effect of that purple color. Although Han's son couldn't tell how the purple air might affect their bodies, it obviously wasn't something that boded well. Han's son stopped. He used his blood pulse sutra and his jade skin, but he couldn't remove the purple air from his skin. And although they had stopped, the purple air continued to grow stronger. Han's son summoned his gold demon bug king Bysema, but that proved to be useless too. The purple air was still able to penetrate the gold demon bug king Bysema and dye him and the blood Kirin. Han's son looked at the egg that the little red bird had turned into. There was no purple air permeating it, and that made Han's son feel a little relief. If the little red bird's egg wasn't infected, then that meant there might be a way to deflect the force. It wasn't invulnerable. Han's son looked back and noticed that he could no longer see the way he had come. There was no end, and Han's son gritted his teeth. Chapter 2277. 1 in a billion chance. The Hell Ghosts on both sides stared coldly at Han's son and the blood Kirin. They were like a crowd gathered to watch a funeral procession. It didn't seem as if they wished to do anything to stop the intruders, though. As Han's son continued to walk, he thought about his situation. Those who are outside of this bridge can see what is actually going on, so the Hell Ghosts really are just statues. They only appear to be alive because I am on the bridge. It could be just a feeling, or the adverse effect of some type of power, that gives them the appearance of life. The Hell Ghosts aren't attacking us, but they might be configured to release power of some sort. If this line of thinking is correct, then how did Isha end up in the clutches of that menacing statue? Does that mean there is one Hell Ghost statue that is actually a living being? Han's son wondered. He and the blood Kirin continued to walk across the bridge. The purple stain in their skin deepened as they went, but the way ahead of them was still clear. The purple jade bridge reached on without an end in sight. That purple air didn't seem to be affecting their bodies, but it made Han's son rather worried all the same. These purple airs might be part of a process to build up power. The more that is gathered, the stronger the inevitable explosion would be, Han Sen thought to himself. Because the Jade Bridge's length had been extended by the distorted dimension, Han Sen rode the blood Kirin as it sprinted at top speed for over 100 hours. Only then did they finally see the middle of the bridge coming up. Just as it had appeared on the outside, Isha had been grabbed by a giant evil hell ghost. The sight was quite different now that Han Sen was standing on the bridge, though. The giant hell ghost wasn't a statue in this place. It was an actual creature. It had purple skin and wings, and its head had a pair of purple horns that looked like bull horns. Its body was like a wild monkey. It gripped Isha tightly, and its eyes were shining with purple light. "Queen!" Han Sen shouted at Isha as he rode closer to her on the blood Kirin. When Han Sen had called to her from outside the bridge, Isha had been unable to hear him. Now that they were in the same dimension, Han Sen thought he might be able to get her attention. Isha slowly started to open her eyes. She rolled her head over to look at Han Sen, but it was clearly a struggle in her weakened state. As she saw Han Sen coming across the bridge, Isha's expression became strange. She stared at him for a while, as if she was trying to determine whether Han Sen was real or just a delirious fantasy. "My queen, are you okay?" Han Sen shouted as he came toward her. The statue that held Isha didn't behave as if it had heard Han Senator, it just continued to hold Isha, as if it hadn't noticed Han Sen and the blood Kirin. "Why are you here?" Isha whispered. Han Sen could tell that she could barely summon the strength to speak. "It's a long story, we can talk about it later. But tell me, how can I help you?" Han Sen asked. Isha shook her head. "You should find a way to save yourself. Your body has collected a lot of that hellish air. If you don't leave, the hell ghost will soon see you. And when that happens, it will be too late for you to run. Get off of this hell bridge, and you might find a way to survive." "You selected the hell bridge for a specific reason, yes?" Han Sen asked. It didn't look as if he intended to leave anytime soon. "Do not waste time talking to me about this. Get lost." Isha scolded him with a frown. "I'm not the only one here. There is a deified elite waiting for me, and she is my enemy. Even if I do make it out of here, I'm just going to end up dead," Han Sen said with a shrug. Isha looked surprised. She quietly said, "You are a magnet for trouble. Whatever then. Since you are here, let's try something out. Maybe we can both live through this." "My lady, you have a way to get out of here?" Han Sen asked. Isha smiled and said, "I selected the Hell Bridge, so I could use the Hell power to activate my rebate Elder Blood. That way I could become deified. But I failed. Since you are here, perhaps you can help me try again. The success rate is low, but it is certainly worth a try." "How do I help?" Han Sen quickly asked. Isha took a deep breath and slowly said, "I told you before. Our rebate elder used to be a servant for an important person amongst the Extreme King. That man was called Hell King. He had a Hell God body, and it possessed an intense Hell power." Isha began coughing, and had to take a deep breath before continuing her speech. "Because he treated our elder very nicely, Hell King put some of his Hell King blood into her body. So that way, our elder could one day become deified and create teeth power. It was all because of Hell King's blood. Regrettably, the Hell King blood I possess is too weak. The rebate elder was given a powerful gift, but she didn't possess the blood naturally. When it was passed from child to child, it became weaker with every generation. After so many years have passed, the Hell King blood is so light that it might not even exist anymore. I wanted to use the Hell power to activate the Hell King blood, but it proved to be too difficult. Either that or the blood has vanished completely." Isha looked at Han Sr. "But now, even though this is a 1 in a billion chance, we have to take it. However, I have no power, and so I will have to make use of your power. If it doesn't work, you and I will die here together. If you don't want to take this risk, you should leave now while there is still time." "How can I help you?" Han Sen repeated. If Han Sen didn't save Isha, it wouldn't matter if he made it to the other side of the Hell Bridge alive. Fox Queen would be waiting. If he was able to help Isha become deified, things might turn out differently. Isha was his teacher. If he saved her, Isha would probably help him get the Sacred Leader's legacy treasure. And with a deified elite next to him, He would no longer have to fear Fox Queen. Isha sighed. She looked at the hell ghost that had grabbed her and told Han Sun. This ghost statue is the key to this entire hell bridge. All the power of the hell bridge stems from this. If I can get its blood, perhaps then I can become deified. Isha took a deep breath and went on to say, it is not living, by the way. It is just a statue with hell blood. It is currently attracted by my power, and so most of its power is focused solely on me. You can use this opportunity to break its body and collect the hell blood. Help me become deified. The success rate is so low though. Chapter 2278 Unbreakable Statue Plus. I know that there is hell blood in the statue, but I don't know where it is concentrated. And since you are still so weak, I'm not even sure you can damage it. On top of that, even if I do get the hell blood, the success rate of activating my own hell blood is low. That is why I have told you it is a 1 in a billion chance. If you have a method of escape, I suggest you make use of it now. By the time Isha finished speaking, her face had grown even paler. Han Sun turned to face the statue. Then he activated his purple eye butterfly. If he wanted to live, he needed Isha. He didn't want to watch her die either. If there was a way to save her and resolve his own dire situation by extension, he wanted to try. It was killing two birds with one stone. But as Isha had said, it was a dangerous thing to attempt. If they failed, there was a very high chance he could die. If Han Sen's strike didn't work, the ghost statue might attack him in return. Fortunately, Han Sun had the bird's nest to defend himself. With a shield like that, he didn't have to be afraid. Plus, he had the blood Kirin. Even if his own power couldn't break the body of the ghost statue, the blood Kirin's strength might be enough. But before he could allow the blood Kirin to attack, Han Sun first needed to locate the hell blood inside the ghost statue. And when he had located it, he had to ensure success in a single hit. He didn't know if he would be given a second chance. The purple eye butterfly kept analyzing the ghost statue. Han Sun detected many mysterious substance chains wrapping around and through the statue. Those substance chains were very complex, and they were difficult to understand. But Han Sun didn't have to understand how the ghost statue was made. All he had to do was locate the point where the hell blood was stored. Through the Dongxian aura and purple eye butterfly's combined analysis, Han Sen's eyes eventually brightened. It's there. When Han Sun looked at the ghost statue's eyebrow, he noticed there was an extra tight substance chain. The purple substance was so thick that he could not detect a single seam. Blood Kirin, attack here. Han Sun lifted his Thunder God spike and took aim at the ghost statue's eyebrow. The blood Kirin was carrying Han Sun, and the beast glowed with red light. Blood air swirled around to cover its entire body. It loosed a thunderous roar before leaping up at the ghost statue's eyebrow. Isha was surprised as she watched her student. She was too weak to participate, and it was only now that she noticed the beast that Han Sun was riding. It was a scary half-deified being, she could tell. It wasn't an ordinary half-deified creature, either. It had to be at the very top of what was achievable in that class. Isha was surprised Han Sun was able to command such a powerful mount. The sight gave her a little bit of hope to cling to. A xenogeniac that was almost as strong as her might be able to crack the ghost statue and retrieve the hell blood she required. While Isha was mulling this over, the blood Kirin's claws were tearing through the fabric of space. The beast lashed out at the ghost statue's forehead, sending a vicious attack against the statue's brow. But suddenly, the ghost statue shone with purple light. Before Han Sun and the blood Kirin could react, the statue's other hand grabbed the blood Kirin, just as it had Isha. Its sharp nails dug into the blood Kirin's flesh. The blood Kirin let out a horrendous screech. The statue's talons easily punched through the creature's tough scales, and they were digging in deep. Han Sun was saved by the fact that the ghost statue's claws only went for the blood Kirin. He tumbled to the surface of the bridge. Looking up at what had occurred, he was given a shock. Without a doubt, the ghost statue's power was deified. Even the blood Kirin couldn't fight it off. The powerful creature was in the statue's hand, and no matter how much the blood Kirin tried to struggle, it could not pry itself free from the claws. The blood Kirin kept squirming in a bid to get free, but that only made the claws sink in deeper. Blood seeped out in greater and greater volume, Isha looked depressed. She had underestimated the statue's cunning. She thought she was pulling the attention and power of the ghost statue's power. But now, she realized that the ghost statue had more power than she initially assumed. The power it had used to attack the Blood Kirin was as great as anything she could unleash herself. Blood Kirin, don't move! Han Sun shouted up at the Blood Kirin from where he stood on the bridge. The Blood Kirin, upon hearing Han Sen's voice, stopped squirming and resigned itself to the pain it was already feeling. When the Blood Kirin stopped fighting the ghost statue, the powers of the ghost statue's claws seemed to lessen. Damn it! Now I understand. It wasn't because Isha and the Blood Kirin weren't strong enough. The thing attacked them because they have hell power already. Han Sun looked at his own purple body and the purple air. The ghost statue wasn't a creature. Just as Isha had said, it was indeed a statue, and inside its body was a pocket of hell blood. That was the source of its strength. While it did have a lot of power, it lacked intelligence. It didn't make plans or schemes. It did the job it was programmed to do. It was the hell power inside Han Sun that would cause the statue to act. If Han Sun used his power, the hell power that was now inside his body would be triggered, and the ghost statue in turn would be prompted to make its move. The events would play out like falling dominoes. Unless Han Sun could get rid of the hell power, not even a deified elite could block the ghost statue's attack. Once enough hell power accumulated within Han Sen's body, the ghost statue would attack him even if he didn't act first. Just as it had been for Isha. When she walked across the bridge, she hadn't attacked the ghost statue, but the statue still grabbed her. That was why she was unable to evade it. Han Sun and the Blood Kirin hadn't activated the ghost statue when they walked near it because of the bird's nest. Han Sun had thought that the bird's nest was ineffectual against the hell power, but it actually had gotten rid of some of it. That was why the hell power in Han Sun and the Blood Kirin hadn't triggered the ghost statue to attack the moment they walked up to it. Han Sun suddenly felt a headache coming on. The problem was no longer getting the hell blood from the statue. It was the fact that he couldn't even hit the ghost statue. If Han Sun used a certain amount of power, then the hell blood that had accumulated in his body would be triggered. Then the ghost statue would come after him. He wouldn't be able to escape if he was struck by it. Just go. Isha was smart, and she understood the issue as well. She knew she couldn't escape her predicament. Once their bodies were infected by hell powers, all hope of defeating the ghost statue was lost. The same would be true even if a deified elite joined them. Han Sun stared at the ghost statue and did not speak. He didn't want to simply leave. He hadn't saved Isha yet, and now the Blood Kirin had been captured as well. There was no way Han Sun was going to throw in the towel and call it quits now. Han Sun was holding the Thunder God spike. The wings on his back flashed, and he teleported in front of the ghost statue. But the instant he got close enough to strike, the fist that was holding Isha slammed into him. Pang! Han Sun used the bird's nest to protect himself, but he was still sent flying. He flew in a long arc that ended with a crunching impact with the hard surface of the bridge. Han Sen's body was like a meteor thudding into the earth. He might not have broken the bridge, but the same could not be said for his body. He coughed, and blood sprayed the ground in front of him. Chapter 2279. A needle. Because Han Sun had used a fair amount of his own power, it activated the hell power in his body. The ghost statue came to life and flapped its wings. It rose above Han Sun, then dropped like a hawk, its feet outstretched to grab Han's senator. There was no way he would be able to dodge. The ghost statue was drawn toward Han Sen's hell power like a magnet. When its feet came down, they were going to smash Han Sun into a pulp. The statue fell, and its claws closed around Han's senator dong. The ghost statue's claws grabbed the bird's nest and tried to crush it. They failed. Hidden safely under the bird's nest, Han Sun felt a modicum of relief. If the bird's nest was able to withstand the attacks of the ghost statue, then that meant he had a chance to fight back. Perhaps being under the cover of the bird's nest calmed Han Sen's hell power. Regardless of the reason, the ghost statue released the bird's nest and returned to its spot atop the pillar. Han Sun spent a while thinking. He cast his jade skin power and threw a punch at the ghost statue. Jade skin's power might be perfect for this work. Perhaps using that power wouldn't trigger the hell power within Han Senator. Maybe he could avoid waking up the ghost statue. But that line of thought soon proved to be naive. As soon as Han Sun teleported, he was sent flying again. Fortunately, he had the bird's nest to absorb some of the blow. With its help, he was able to avoid death once more. But even so, Han Sun was still bleeding a lot by this point. Teeth power. Suppress evil. Turtle skill. Under the sky knife skill. Lone bamboo's sword skills. Thunder power. Fire power. Ice power. Han Sun used all the powers he could remember, but each one proved to be useless. No matter what power he summoned, the ghost statue would break it. Han Sun couldn't touch the horrid thing, and it kept tossing him aside like a toy. If it wasn't for the aid of the bird's nest, he would have been killed many times. Even with the bird's nest for protection, his impacts with the bridge had injured him. His wounds might not have been as bad as they looked, but they did look very bad. Stop trying. Just go. Isha growled. She was feeling a complex mixture of emotions. Han Sun had that bird's nest for protection, so he had some measure of protection from deified attacks. If there was a deified elite around, though, his ability to escape wasn't guaranteed. But Han Sun was taking so many risks in his attempts to free her that Isha couldn't help but feel touched. Isha didn't believe she had treated Han Sun all that well. She had simply given him resources, and she had only taken him as a student because of a bet she had once struck with a psychic. It was only afterward that she realized that having Han Sun as a student wasn't all bad. When she realized that she had a student who would fight for her in a situation as dire as this, it was difficult not to feel touched. Isha would never have considered that Han Sun might be doing this, because he didn't want to lose an advantage. Her life being at stake was only a small part of it. Han Sun wasn't going to lose Isha and a half-deified blood Kirin. That was why he kept trying and trying. He didn't want to lose so much. Han Sun had the bird's nest, so he wasn't going to die easily. That's why he kept trying. But the results of his attacks were not encouraging. Han Sun tried every trick in the book, but none of his powers could overcome the ghost statue's power. The ghost statue responded to hell power far too well. It was like cause and effect. If Han Sun had hell power, it meant he was going to get hit by the ghost statue. There was no other possible outcome. In all his attacks, Han Sun hadn't touched the ghost statue's forehead once. Thinking about getting the hell blood out of the ghost statue's forehead was useless, because he couldn't. As Han Sun kept trying and getting knocked back, even his armor was dyed red by the blood that spilled from him. Isha's expression looked pained. The ghost statue struck Han Sun again, and sent him crashing down into the bridge once more. This time, though, he stayed hidden beneath the bird's nest for a while. Are you dead yet? If you're not, then get lost. Isha shouted angrily, but her eyes shimmered. Han Sun didn't move. He was hiding under the bird's nest, thinking about how he might break the hell power, or the connection between it and the ghost statue. I have used all of my powers at least once, and even so, I haven't been able to land a hit. The only possibility remaining is to use my super god spirit body. By using my super god spirit body, I can remove the hell power and avoid being harmed by the ghost statue. But if I do that, then Isha will know that I am Dollar. This is bad. Han Sun felt depressed. After everything he had been through, though, seeing Isha and the blood Kirin get killed was the last thing he wanted. He needed to try this, even if it meant exposing his identity. As Han Sun was thinking, Isha shouted, Han Sun, are you dead yet? Get out of here if you aren't. My queen, why would one like myself die so easily? You underestimate the fortitude of your students. Han Sun placed the bird's nest on his head like a hat as he spoke to Isha. His body and face were drenched in blood, and with the bird's nest on his head, although it was a very sober situation, it looked rather funny. Isha's lips were shaking, but after a brief while, they returned to a cold stare again. She looked at Han Sun, opened her lips and sprayed spittle at him. Drops of blood fell down on Han Sun like rain. Han Sun was surprised, and he wasn't quite sure what Isha was doing. Dongong! Within that sprinkling of blood, something landed on the bridge in front of Han Senator. Han Sun took a closer look. It was a red sewing needle. It was thinner than a hair, and it was around the length of a finger. What is this? Han-sun picked it up. He thought that something about the sewing needle was very unusual. It felt like it was made of bone rather than metal. It was very small, but it was hollow inside. It was more like a needle for injection than a sewing needle. When Han-sun lifted the bone needle, he felt it summon power inside his body. His energy started to circulate. Han-sun stared with wide eyes. The power that was running was blood pulse plunder, which he had learned not so long ago. Isha said quietly, "Most of the items I brought along with me were destroyed. This is a small item I managed to obtain from a broken statue. Take it as a souvenir and go." Upon hearing that, Han-sun suddenly became very happy. "The statue you mentioned, is that the one in the ruined palace? Stop wasting fucking time. Get out now. Even if I die, you have to reclaim Planet Blade. Take care of my palace, because I don't want anyone to touch my stuff," Isha snarled. "If you weren't there, what would be the point of me staying in that palace of yours?" Han-sun asked distractedly, as he turned the needle over in his hands. "That is my business, just do as you're told," Isha said. Han-sun smiled at Isha. "I must apologize, my queen. I am a guy who would rather have his freedom and be able to relax as he chooses. I'm not a fan of staying put and looking after something. You should really go and take care of your own palace." Isha returned his smile with a wry one of her own. "If I could return, I wouldn't be talking to you right now, would I?" She started to say something more, but suddenly Han-sun froze. He was staring at the ghost statue, and with a flick of his wrist, he tossed the needle toward it. Isha sighed. She had spent some time researching that bone needle. It was almost completely indestructible, but it had no power. She had been unable to feel any power residing at its tip. If she had been able to use the bone needle, and any power it possessed to break the ghost statue, she wouldn't have been bound there when Han-sun found her. But Isha stared with a slack jaw as the bone needle sailed toward the statue, completely unimpeded. The ghost statue had knocked Han-sun to the ground countless times, but it didn't react to the bone needle at all. It merely watched the bone needle strike its forehead. How is this possible? Isha's eyes were wide. She gazed at the strange scene with disbelief. When the bone needle pierced the ghost statue's forehead, the needle lit up red. It shone brighter and brighter, and before long, the ghost statue started to shake. The noise of breaking rocks began to rumble around them. Pang! The next moment, the statue fell to pieces. The grip holding Isha and the blood Kirin was suddenly released. They fell to the bridge, the shattered remains of the statue's hands falling around them. The blood Kirin was injured, but it hadn't lost much strength. It gathered itself back up, and its signature red cloud swirled around it. Isha was close to death, and the blood in her body had almost run dry. She was very weak, and she didn't have the strength to react. She fell to the ground limply. Han-sun caught her in his arms to prevent her from hitting the bridge. He smiled and said, "My queen, it looks like you are going to have to tend to your palace after all." The purple air across the entire jade bridge began to spread and thin. Giant rocks began to fall. Isha was held in Han-sun's arms. As she looked up at Han-sun from below, her heart started to feel strange. She had never seen a man from a lower angle. She was always the one up high. She had never felt like this before. And suddenly, she started to feel even weaker. As the last pieces of the ghost statue fell, the purple air across the bridge began to evaporate. Han-sun, the blood Kirin, and Isha started to return to normal. The jade bridge that had seemed endless now looked as it previously had. They could see the other 12 jade bridges around them, and the 13 teleporters in front of them. Fox Queen and the others, however, were gone. They must have traveled through the teleporter and left that palace. Because the blood Kirin was injured, Han-sun opted not to ride it. He was still holding Isha as he strode across the jade bridge. "You're not going to go through the teleporter?" Isha asked weakly from where she was cradled against Han-sun's chest. "Of course I will. But before that, I want to walk across the rest of the jade bridges," Han-sun said with a smile. Han-sun wanted to walk the 13 bridges for one simple reason. He wanted to get each statue's power. After Isha gave him the bone needle, he realized that the bone needle was a xenogenic treasure that combined with blood pulse plunder. If he used blood pulse plunder by itself, he would need to beat the enemy first. He couldn't use blood pulse plunder to take away an opponent's blood pulse until the enemy didn't have enough power to fight back. If Han Sun was squaring off against an extra strong enemy, though, there was always the chance that he might not be able to beat them. During times like that, blood pulse plunder wouldn't be very useful. But with this bone needle, things were different. Han Sun could imbue the bone needle with the powers of blood pulse plunder. After that, he only had to put the bone needle into an enemy's body, and the bone needle would plunder the enemy's blood pulse. Han Sun only needed to stick the needle into a foe. That being said, the bone needle wasn't powerful on its own. Han Sun would have to use his own strength, but piercing a needle into an enemy was still far easier than trying to beat an opponent that had him bested. The statues on the 13 bridges were each prepared for the combination of blood pulse plunder and the bone needle. The bone needle could easily pierce the statues and take the hidden blood pulse power that resided within them. Han Sun would basically have to repeat what he did to the ghost statue. The bone needle had a concentration of power now too. It was just a drop, but it was a blood pulse hell power. It was a deified power. There had to be something similar on the other 12 bridges. That was something Han Sun was most assuredly not going to miss out on. Han Sun switched positions and carried Isha on his back. He walked to another jade bridge, and just as he had expected, the first half was safe. When he approached a statue in the middle of the bridge, he used the bone needle to absorb the blood pulse power inside the statue. The statue then fell, and the bridge lost its protection. It became an ordinary jade bridge again. Han Sun walked through the rest of the bridges and took the blood pulse power from the statues. Isha's surprise was written plainly across her face, making it obvious that she had no clue why the bone needle was so powerful in Han Sun's hands. Isha had picked up the bone needle, but she had no idea that the needle had to be used in conjunction with blood pulse plunder. She didn't have blood pulse plunder, so aside from its sturdiness, the needle had no utility in her hands. The second sacred leader statue had been destroyed for some reason, so Han Sun hadn't been able to retrieve the bone needle personally. Yet it landed in his hands anyway when Isha volunteered it. The sacred leader had blocked all the routes, but something had been left on each path for those that traversed it. The items were connected with each other in ways that Han Sun hadn't yet figured out. The sacred leader's full plans were still a mystery. The silver Saises, blood pulse plunder, the bone needle, 13 blood pulse powers. They were all very rare and valuable treasures. At this point, he could easily start a fight with a deified being. The treasures were meant to be obtained through tests given by the sacred leader. No one had realized how scary the sacred leader's treasures could be. "My queen, are you afraid of needles?" Han Sun asked Isha. Isha was shocked, and she did not know what he meant. "I mean, are you afraid of being pricked with a needle?" Han Sun blinked and asked, "Are you going to give me a shot?" Isha looked at Han. Senator Han Sun lifted his bone needle while he smiled at Isha. "Close your eyes if you are afraid. The pain will be over in a second." After that, Han Sun thrust his bone needle into Isha's chest. A drop of hell blood came out, and it blended into Isha's own blood. If he wanted to survive, he had to get rid of Fox Queen. And unless another deified elite challenged her, it was unlikely Fox Queen could be defeated. Even with Han Sun's deified blood pulse, his actual power wouldn't be deified. Isha, however, was different. She was half a step away from being deified herself. Getting the hell blood pulse would give her a boost towards the lofty goal of becoming deified. This was their best chance of taking the sacred leader's treasure. The hell blood pulse blended into Isha's body. Suddenly, a plume of purple air burst out of Isha. It solidified into a purple substance chain and wrapped around her, loop upon loop. Everything she had, her clothes, her accessories, her armor, and all sorts of other things, disintegrated into nothing but dust under the power of that substance chain. As the chain surrounded her, Isha curled her long body into a ball, like a fetus in the womb. Once Isha was safely encased within the purple cocoon, all became quiet. In a giant palace, Fox Queen, Mr. White, and Crime were traveling forward. Fox Queen suddenly stopped. She looked around her and said, "Mr. White, is this the correct path?" Why have we been walking for so long? And yet we are still in the same palace. Mr. White slowly said. This must be the 4th checkpoint for the treasure. We have to travel through here to get to where the treasure is. How do we get through here, then? Fox Queen asked Mr. White. This palace seems to have a space power restriction. My powers are weak here, and so I am afraid I might not be able to break the restriction. Perhaps this is something you will have to do, Mr. White said after a think. And how would I do something like that? Fox Queen asked with a frown. Judging from the calculations I have made, we can start right there. Mr. White pointed at a stone pillar as he spoke. Fox Queen looked at the stone pillar and groaned. She didn't move. Han Sun stared at Isha with a look of surprise. The whole process had gone far better than he expected. The Hell Blood Pulse activated the Hell King blood she had inside her body. They fused with Isha's already considerable strength. She had broken through and become deified with no trouble at all. When she emerged from her cocoon and ascended, Isha was wearing a set of purple armor. Her regal presence blanketed everything around them, as if she was the queen of the entire universe. If you dare to tell anyone about what just happened, I will kill you. Isha stared daggers at Han Sun as she spoke. My queen, I didn't see anything. Han Sun blinked innocently, but deep inside, he was thinking to himself, women are weird. Moments ago, she was begging to be deified. And now, after becoming deified, she still isn't happy. Does she really care about a small and inconsequential detail like being naked? Her naked body is quite nice. Why is she so upset? Isha only stared at Han Sun in response. She turned silently and looked to the 13 teleporters. Then she said, which teleporter do you think we should use? Clearly, Isha wasn't very good when it came to this sort of maze. It seemed as if she had forced her way through the palaces by trial and error. I'm not very good at figuring out the path either. If I was to guess though, I would assume they went through the teleporter at the end of the life and death cycle bridge. But even if we select the right one this time, we won't know where to go next. We'd have to try every single one we come to. Han Sun stopped to think for a moment, and then resumed talking. My queen, how did you come this far in the first place? Isha thought and said, I was with the Ice Blue Knights. While I was exploring a planet with a group of knights, we accidentally woke up a deified xenogeniac called Under Overbearing. I was swallowed by it. At first I thought I was dead. I had been swallowed, and I knew that its stomach could digest anything. Even deified creatures would melt in there. Just when I lost all hope, I found a seam that allowed me to escape the stomach. I wiggled through the crack and got out. After traversing many caves and passing by a shattered statue, I ended up entering a palace. It must have been one of the palaces on Under Overbearing's back. Wait a minute. Are you saying that you aren't the one who destroyed the floor in one of the palaces? And you didn't break the sacred leader statue? Han Sun asked Isha with shock. Of course not. My power wasn't strong enough to destroy anything in the palace, Isha said. If you didn't break the palace, then that means someone else entered the palaces before you did. That kraken Under Overbearing's stomach might have also been his work, Han Sun mused quietly. Isha nodded. It is certainly possible, and he might indeed be around here someplace. What makes you think that? Han Sun asked curiously. The crack in the Under Overbearing's stomach couldn't have been there for very long. With how quickly the beast heals, the wound must have been made less than a week before. After a week, the damaged stomach would have healed completely, Isha said slowly. Han Sun frowned. Then he might really still be in these palaces. But how could he leave no trace in the palace? If he was here, he would have left behind some indication of his presence. But aside from that one ruined palace, the rest of the trail was left by you, yes? Isha nodded and said, yes. And while I was exploring, I didn't see any sign of someone else having entered. Plus, he broke the statue, but he didn't take the bone needle inside. That's just weird. Was he too careless to find out what it harbored? But then again, how could such a powerful elite be that careless? It doesn't really make any sense, Han Sun said. Isha sighed. Maybe he just doesn't care about the items in this place? Han Sun was stunned by the suggestion, but as he considered the idea, it made sense. That might indeed be possible. He must be a very powerful person to create a hole in under overbearing stomach. Maybe his real target is the final treasure of the sacred leader. If that is the case, then that doesn't bode well for us. Han Sun walked across the bridge of life and death. They arrived at the door of light and walked on through. The teleporter deposited them into a palace, the same as usual. There was a main hall, 2 side halls, and a hall in the back. All in all, there were 4 different teleporters. Han Sun looked around and spoke to Isha. I think they left via the back hall. How do you know that? Isha asked in surprise. I can see the auras left behind by their bodies. Han Sun explained simply. He was suspicious too, though. The more powerful a person was, the less of a trail they would leave behind. And that trail didn't last forever. Mr. White and the others had been gone for a long time by this point. Under ordinary circumstances, it should have been hard for Han Sun to detect the trace elements they had left behind. In fact, Han Sun didn't see any traces of Fox Queen or crime, but he could see molecules that Mr. White had left lingering in the air. That didn't seem normal. Perhaps Mr. White made his trail visible on purpose? Han Sun guessed to himself. But how could he know that Isha and I would survive? Why is he leaving me clues? Or is this all just a trap? Chapter 2282. The place where treasure lies. Han Sun and Isha were unable to make the calculations to determine the correct path. But instead of marching ahead recklessly, they could follow the traces left behind by Mr. White. In the end, that proved to be a very effective solution for navigating the palaces. Han Sun, Isha, and the Blood Kirin followed Mr. White's tracks through each teleporter door. Han Sun was the guide. Thankfully, they didn't encounter any dangers along the way. They went through a few palaces, and their journey remained uneventful. It was an entirely safe course to follow. What is Mr. White planning? Han Sun wondered. He didn't know why Mr. White was taking this risk. It didn't make sense for Mr. White to believe that Han Sun had the strength to stand up to Fox Queen. It also didn't seem likely that Mr. White would leave a trail behind just to cause Fox Queen trouble. Using the evidence of Mr. White's passage as a guide, Han Sun and Isha made quick progress. It wasn't long before they arrived at the 4th checkpoint. What they saw there made Han Sun and Isha frown profusely. The hall was half collapsed. Broken pillars and remnants of a destroyed ceiling lay strewn across the entire place. Han Sun looked across the hall, but he found no hide nor hair of a sacred leader statue there. In fact, there was nothing of any remarkability there. It looks like Fox Queen managed to make it through this checkpoint, Han Sun said when he found nothing of interest in the palace. I wonder what the sacred leader left behind here. Whatever it was, Fox Queen must have made off with it. Han Sun frowned. The sacred leader's items were all linked. If they were missing an item, they might run into a lot of trouble further down the line. Han Sun and Isha had no choice but to keep going. When they went through the next teleporter, though, what they saw gave them a shock. They hadn't arrived at another palace. When they stepped out of the teleporter, they found themselves on the shore of an endless ocean. Under overbearing was as big as a planet. It wasn't really surprising to see an ocean on such an entity, but the sight still made Han Sun feel depressed. Mr. White and the others must have begun crossing the oceans, but the ocean wind had destroyed all traces of Mr. White's trail. It's such a big ocean. I'm afraid it might be too difficult to locate Mr. White and the others, Han Sun said sadly. Isha looked around. After a while of thought, she said, this could be where the sacred leader hid his treasure. Perhaps they haven't even gone very far, but they're exploring someplace below the waves. Han Sun had thought of this possibility as well. If the treasure was in the water, finding Mr. White and the others might be even harder. I guess we have no choice but to take a look, Han Sun said. Isha nodded and dipped into the sea. Her body unleashed a purple smoke, and when the smoke came into contact with the water parted. Han Sun and the Blood Kirin moved next to Isha. They headed deep into the sea, surrounded by the sphere of dryness provided by Isha. Isha's purple smoke kept the water about 10 meters at bay. After they started their dive, they descended deep into the ocean. They walked 100 miles beneath the sea, and in all that time, they didn't catch sight nor sound of any other creature. The ocean looked dead. It was like a long dead sea that was no longer fit for any living thing. Suddenly, a giant shadow moved in the water. Isha stopped and stared at that giant shadow in the sea. The shadow was approaching them quickly. Han's son was given a proper fright when he saw what the thing was. It was a giant xenogeniac that looked like a whale. Its body was pure white. The white whale was more than 1,000 meters long, and every move sent devastating shockwaves rolling through the sea. Many small vortexes popped up around it. Deified creature, Isha said quietly. I didn't expect under Overbearing's body to be the home of other deified creatures. I'm afraid that, aside from the sacred leader, no other being could do something like that. Han's son had a wry smile. The big white whale noticed the three of them. After all, there were no other creatures in that ocean, so their presence was rather noticeable. That was especially true of Isha and the Blood Kirin. One of them was a deified elite, and the other was full of blood air. It was difficult not to notice their presence. When the big white whale was 1,000 meters away from them, it suddenly opened its mouth and released a high-pitched sonic wave. At the same time, its mouth produced a strong force of suction. Many giant vortexes swirled to life within the water. They snared everything within range and pulled it all into the whale's belly. Wisps of Isha's purple air began to flow into that vortex, and their sphere of air suddenly started to feel the force of that suction. More and more of the purple air was pulled away through the water, taken in the direction of the creature's mouth. Isha frowned. She used her hand as a knife, and the purple air suddenly gathered up into a large swathe of knife air. She lifted her arms above her head and slashed towards the vortex. The knife air became a roaring purple air demon. It was headed right for the giant white whale. It broke through the vortex that the big white whale had generated, but the demon-looking knife air didn't stop there. It continued on, going right for the white whale's head. The big white whale showed no indication that it was going to dodge the incoming blow. In fact, its mouth widened even further. It looked like a gaping black hole. Its powers of suction increased, and it swallowed Isha's demon knife air effortlessly. Gudong! The giant white whale swallowed the demonic knife air whole, then let out a satisfied burp. It then spat out some air and created loads of bubbles in the sea. Han's son was dumbfounded. Isha had just become deified, and she was filled with hell power. She also had the teeth knife skills. Her talents were famous among many races, and her wrecking abilities were widely renowned. The big white whale, however, had swallowed her attack easily. The power that the giant white whale possessed was truly scary. Isha frowned. Purple substance chains rose from her body and began to align in mysterious patterns. They created a purple knife air around Isha's body. Isha's entire body was now full of a knife mind. It felt to Han's son as if she was a cruel knife herself, that she could wreck anything at any time. Isha raised the full extent of her power and prowess, but the giant white whale still didn't seem to be afraid. It opened its mouth, and the black hole power returned. It sucked everything nearby into its mouth. Sand and water came rolling in like they were being pulled into a bottomless pit. Seeing the giant white whale open its mouth again, Isha coldly shouted. Her arms swung at the big white whale. The roaring demon headed for the big white whale once more, dispersing the sand and shattering the rocks as it went. It left a trail of devastation behind it. The purple knife air and the big white whale's black hole collided with each other. The black hole was destroyed, and the purple knife air was shattered. The shockwave of the collision exploded the entire sea. Huge waves surged across its surface, and it was like the entire ocean had been turned upside down. The two strikes were balanced, though neither had the upper hand. The next second, Isha and Han's son's eyes widened. The big white whale's mouth was still hanging open, and suddenly, something flew out of it. It wrapped around Isha, Han's son, and the Blood Kirin, then pulled them into the big white whale's belly. Chapter 2283 Bronze Bell. It was a big bronze bell that had covered Han's son, Isha, and the Blood Kirin. Isha's purple substance chain became a knife air. She waved her hand to strike the surface of the bell, but it only made a loud, tolling noise. The bell showed no sign of damage. What is this bell? Why was it in the white whale's belly? Can xenogenics make use of xenogenic treasures? Han Sun was shocked. Dong! The bronze bell landed on something, and then it stopped moving. Isha continued to strike the bell with her knife air, but the bronze bell suddenly lifted away from them. It flew to the side, freeing them. Isha immediately surrounded Han Sun and the blood Kirin with her power to protect them. Based on the direction that the bell had moved after it covered them, they should have been standing inside the white whale, probably in its stomach. A deified xenogenics digestion system wasn't something an ordinary creature could hope to withstand. Even king-class elites would dissolve quickly inside such a stomach. But when Han Sun and Isha looked around, they froze. This was not a stomach. It was a control room of high-end technology. The tech around them equaled any that might be found in a classy battleship's control room. The most unbelievable thing was that everything in the control room was transparent. They could see outside of the room, and the feelings that the sight elicited were difficult to explain. Although it looked like a whale from the exterior, it was actually governed by machinery. Every piece of the whale's interior was made of crystal of various colors. Humming generators, pounding pistons, and spinning every movement could be seen from where they were. What is this thing? This time, Han Sun was really shocked. The white whale had looked like a deified creature from the outside, but it was actually a technological marvel. It was hard to believe that such an amazing machine actually existed. Isha looked around in shock. Their eyes soon turned to a platform of that primary control room. A man had been sitting in a chair behind the control platform. It was little more than a skeleton at this point, with a few white bones still wrapped in the clothes he had been wearing. The man's clothes looked like a high-tech product, not some treasure armor. Judging from the style of the silver and black clothing, it was possible to determine that the skeleton had been a man. After bringing Han Sun and the others into the room, the bronze bell had drastically reduced its size. It was now about the size of a man's fist, and it rested there in the main control room. Does this sort of technology exist anywhere else in the Geno universe? Han Sun looked at Isha. He had no idea what race might have constructed this marvel of technology. Isha shook her head. There are many technological wonders that have the destructive powers of a deified being, but not many can actually be used in combat. They take far too long to aim and fire, so they can't be used in actual deified fights. They are mostly useful for attacking planets, since planets cannot be moved. The mech's bioarmor is also technological in nature. They have very powerful weapons, but again they are different from what we're seeing here. Clearly, Isha was just as clueless as Han Sr. This has to be another one of the Sacred Leader's creations. Sacred achieved a lot when it came to technology. Han Sun pondered aloud as he looked around. Since the white whale's master appeared to be quite dead, how could the white whale continue to move without someone at the controls? And what had prompted the behemoth to swallow them? Isha walked toward the skeleton. She waved her hand, and one of her purple substance chains dissolved into a purple mist. The mist flowed over the skeleton and began to poke around it. She was looking for some lead or clue they could follow. But before Isha's purple air touched the skeleton, the bronze bell rose from its resting platform and covered up Isha's purple air at once. This old bronze bell defends its master automatically. Is it a piece of technology as well? Han Sun looked at the old bronze bell in shock. Suddenly, Han Sun and Isha heard a boy's voice. You are a technological product. Your entire family is a technological product. Who is that? Han Sun and Isha were shocked. They looked around them, but neither of them could sense any presences. There was just that soul skeleton sitting on the primary control deck. It made Han Sun and Isha feel very uncomfortable. No way. Have we encountered a ghost? Han Sun muttered as he stared at the skeleton. He used his Dongxian aura to scan the skeleton multiple times, but there was no life force. It couldn't have been any more dead, so there was no way that the voice was coming from it. Han Sun could only think that they must be talking to a ghost. You are a ghost. Your entire family is a ghost. The little boy's voice was heard again, and it sounded pretty mad. This time, Han Sun and Isha located the source of the voice. It came from the little bronze bell. The bronze bell shook. Strange symbols glowed across it, and it opened shiny green eyes. Below its eyes was a gap. It looked like a mouth that kept opening and closing. Han Sun stared at the bronze bell that was shouting at him. The body of the bell seemed to be vibrating with rage. What is this thing? Han Sun didn't know how to react. He hadn't displayed any signs of a life force, so he thought it must be a xenogenic treasure. But now that it was talking, it certainly seemed to possess all the traits and characteristics of a living creature. You are a thing. Your entire family is a thing. The bronze bell was becoming even angrier. It was jumping up and down as it shouted, "Are you an AI? If you are, it seems like you are a very cheap one. You can only say the same thing over and over," Han Sun said, looking at the bronze bell with curiosity. The bronze bell started to yell, "You are a..." It trailed off halfway through its shout. If it continued, people really would believe it was an AI. So after its half shout, the bronze bell stopped and settled down a little. With a very cocky look it said, "You stupid low-life creature. Listen up. Your master's name is Big King Bell. But you guys can call me either Master or Big King." After that, Big King Bell thought of something. It looked at Han Sun and said, "Your master is not some sort of AI." Chapter 2284. King Han Sun looked at Isha. They were confused. What was this thing? It was sort of like a treasure, but it wasn't a treasure. It was sort of like a creature, but it wasn't a creature. The jade drum was a creature, but the jade drum was created naturally. It wasn't something that was man-made. Words were scrawled across the little bell's body, though, and that suggested it wasn't a natural being. "Okay, Big King, why did you snatch us and bring us here?" Han Sun asked the bell. Big King Bell rolled its eyes and jumped. He said, "What do you mean by snatch? I was saving you guys. Couldn't you tell? Don't talk big if you don't know shit, kid. You were saving us. How?" Han Sun looked at Big King Bell with confusion. "Ugh, you guys don't understand anything. And yet here you come, waltzing into the Holy Spirit Sea. You must have a death wish. If it wasn't for me saving you guys, you too would have ended up like him. You know, with only bones left." The bell jumped up to land atop the skeleton's skull as it spoke. "Who is he?" Han Sun asked with curiosity. He had originally thought that the skeleton was Big King Bell's master. But now, that didn't seem to be the case. "Huh, this piece of garbage? How do you expect me to remember who he was? He was just another pawn, like a background extra in this tale," Big King Bell proclaimed, lifting his lips in disdain. Han Sun didn't believe the bell. There was no way that an unimportant person would have been in charge of controlling a technological marvel like the white whale. Even if the man hadn't been very powerful personally, he could have used the whale to hold his own against a deified being. "How did he die?" Isha asked Big King Bell. Big King Bell rolled its eyes. He thought that since he had this strange machine, he could cross the Holy Spirit Sea and take the sacred leader's treasure. He had no idea of the power of the Holy Spirit Sea. This thing didn't stand a chance of repelling the sea's power. Not in the least. He died before he even made it to Holy Spirit Town. Only his bones remained. After that, Big King Bell jumped onto the control platform and cockily said, "But this thing was quite interesting, and so I decided to hold on to it as a keepsake." Han Sun knew Big King Bell was talking about the white whale. He looked at the skeleton and told Isha, "This guy must have dived a long time ago. He didn't get here recently." "What? Another creature was here?" Big King Bell asked before Isha could respond. He seemed startled as he stared at Han Sr. "Yeah, there's a few of them." Han Sun looked at Big King Bell and asked, "You came here too? What is so strange about that?" "Ha, I was here." Big King Bell trailed off as a thought crossed his mind. He stopped talking. "Hear what?" Han Sun asked. "Huh." Big King Bell grunted and said, "That is none of your business. Don't you have the relic with you? How were so many other creatures able to reach this place? Or is under overbearing now so old that people are reaching the palace through his mouth?" Han Sun was shocked that Big King Bell knew he possessed the relic. This bell seemed to know things that it shouldn't. So perhaps it was connected to the sacred leader's treasure somehow. "Let's not waste our breath. Give me the relic, and when I open the holy town's treasury, you will receive what you are owed." Big King Bell hovered in the air before Han Sun as it spoke. "You can have the relic, but I will have to see if you have what it takes. Han Sen smiled. I was born deified. I have beaten billions of people in this universe. I am the strongest in the sky or on the land. Even the sacred leader, when he met with me, would refer to me as Big King Brother. Are you honestly trying to compete with me? Big King Bell looked at Han Sen with actual surprise. He hadn't expected Han Sen to be so ignorant. Big King Brother, even if you are so strong, you should demonstrate that strength. Otherwise, how am I honestly supposed to believe that you are as strong as you claim? Han Sen put out his hands as he spoke. I pulled you guys in here on a whim. Wasn't that enough? Do I have to kill you idiots to show you how strong I am? Big King Bell looked at Han Sen coldly as he slowly rose higher into the air. He looked as if he was going to kill Han Sr. Big King Brother. It was a powerful demonstration when you grabbed us. But that isn't enough to make us want to hand over the relic. Will you show me again? If you can convince us, I will give you the relic without argument. Han Sen smiled at Big King Bell. He thought that the Big King Bell was quite interesting, and that was an impetus for Han Sen to trash-talk it. The bronze bell had shielded them as it pulled them inside, but that was because they hadn't been prepared for its sudden arrival. Isha still hadn't shown off her true strength, so Han Sen wasn't worried about annoying the bell. Big King Brother looked down on Han Sen with utter disdain. Even a small fraction of my power would convince you to obey me, but I have way too many powerful Geno arts. Let me think of a weaker one I can show you, just in case my Geno art is too strong, and I accidentally end up killing you all. Big King Bell spun in the air twice, looking as if he had made a decision. He jumped onto the control platform and punched a few buttons. The white whale then rose to the surface and opened its mouth. The front of the control room looked out through the white whale's eyes, letting the operator see what was going on outside. Idiots! I am going to open your eyes to my power. I am going to show you the techniques of a real and invincible elite, Big King Bell said. His body began to glow green and spin as it grew bigger and bigger. The bell turned onto its side, aiming its opening out the white whale's mouth. Then, they heard a loud chiming noise from the bell. A scary shockwave blasted out of the bell. Boom! The whole sea was cut in half by the bell's sonic blast. The waters were parted down to the seafloor, and all the way to the opposite shore of the ocean. Oh damn! This guy really does have a lot of power. Han Sen was frozen. Big King Bell's power really did seem to exceed that of Isha and Fox Queen. Isha looked shaken too. The power that Big King Bell released was truly magnificent. Holy Spirit Sea wasn't just a vat of ordinary seawater either. Isha didn't think she could split that much of it. So how about that? Do you guys believe me now? Give me the relic at once. Follow me, before I decide that I don't like you. If you do come, you guys will benefit greatly, Big King Bell said to Han Sen with a lot of pride. While they were talking, 3 shadows appeared above the sea. It was Fox Queen Mr. White and Crime. When Fox Queen saw the big white whale, she shook her fox tail. An invisible cord of power lashed around the white whale, and she lifted it out of the sea. Big King Bell quickly leaped atop the platform and hit the buttons on the panels. The white whale opened its mouth and created a black hole, then sent a force of suction towards Fox Queen. But Fox Queen's hand tugged on the cord of power, binding the white whale's mouth. The white whale was unable to open its maw, and so the black hole died inside it. Han Sen was waiting to see how Big King Bell disposed of Fox Queen. If she was killed, they'd lose a dangerous enemy. But when Han Sen turned around, he saw Big King Bell pulling out a big bag seemingly out of nowhere. The bell was going to flee out of the whale via the back door. Big King Brother, aren't you going to kill her? Han Sen asked with confusion. I am busy. I will let her live for now, but I will surely remember her. The next time I see her, I will blow some air at her to kill her, Big King Bell said firmly. Then he left through the back door with his big bag in tow. Han Sen and Isha were frozen. They weren't sure about how to react. Chapter 2285 Deified Phi. That guy seemed very spirited. What would make him run away in such a hurry? Han Sen looked at Isha with confusion. Isha sighed and said, maybe its power takes a long time to regenerate. That strike he unleashed might have cost him most of the power he had gathered. Now Han Sun was able to understand. It was like the Red Mist King, that depended on the 7 red mist minks for energy. It took a very long time for such power to be gathered. If Big King Bell had failed to bluff Han Sun and Isha, it knew it had to run once Fox Queen showed up. What do we do now then? Han Sun asked, looking at Isha. Isha didn't answer. She teleported to the back door. Han Sun knew what she meant by that. He mounted the blood Kirin and followed after Isha. Big King Bell was a big phony, but he was familiar with the surrounding area. Getting information from him could be quite useful. After they rushed out of the White Whale, Isha's body flashed away. The blood Kirin was unable to catch up with her. It was like a human having a foot race against a sports car. Half deified had the word deified in it, but they were still king-class beings at their core. Real deified beings were in another league entirely. Han Sun. Isha had chased after Big King Bell, quickly disappearing. Upon seeing Han Sun emerge from the White Whale's belly, Fox Queen called out in surprise. Before Han Sun could think of escaping, Fox Queen flashed before him, and the blood Kirin to block their path. Good timing. Give me the relic, and I will spare your lives. Fox Queen narrowed her eyes at Han Sun, but it looked as if she was smiling. Pretty sister, you are giving me more trouble. I don't have the relic on me. Han Sun looked troubled, and he said, Did you see that person that just ran off? That was my master Knife Queen. I gave her the relic. In that case, let us see if your master or the relic is the most important thing in your heart, Fox Queen said coolly. Many cords of power slid out of her, and they came slithering over to wrap around Han Sun and the blood Kirin. But Han Sun patted his bird's nest, which grew bigger to shield him and the blood Kirin. It blocked out Fox Queen's cords of power. Even so, the cords of power locked tightly around the bird's best. And that meant Han Sun was now unable to escape. My good little brother, you think having this bird's nest will keep me from doing anything to you? Fox Queen smiled, and then she pulled something out from her waist. Han Sun saw the item, and when he did, his heart fell. Fox Queen had brought out a small jade flute. It was less than 1 foot long, and it was a translucent creamy color. It looked very small and fragile. Fox Queen, are you proficient in sonic powers? The bird's nest might not be able to filter out noise, so I don't know if it can withstand sonic powers, Han Sun thought to himself. The bird's nest was not a Bysema, and Han Sun couldn't trigger its full power. He used the bird's nest's power as a protective force, but it was difficult to tell if he could block a sonic attack. Fox Queen brought the small jade flute to her lips. She smiled at Han Sun, and then, she opened those red lips. The jade flute began to produce sweet music. The flute wasn't particularly loud, but a very vague chord of power came out of the flute. The chord was coming for the bird's nest. Han Sun was shocked. He realized that the music of the flute could seep through the dry grass of the bird's nest, and that realization made him depressed. He had received the approval of the undying bird's nest, and so he was able to make use of the bird's nest. But that usage was limited. Since he couldn't activate the bird's nest's power, he couldn't utilize its defensive properties. Fox Queen's flute sounds were able to sink into Han Sun's bird's nest, and there was nothing he could do to prevent it. That music of the flute sank into the bird's nest like silk strands coming to tangle up Han Sun and the blood Kirin. Han Sun and the blood Kirin did their best to free themselves, but they were ultimately unable to get rid of the flute's music. Under the influence of the flute, Han Sun couldn't control himself. He lifted the bird's nest and began crawling out like a puppet on strings. Oh no! Oh no! Han Sun felt terrible. Seeing Han Sun slowly moving out of the bird's nest, Fox Queen's expression was beatific. But when Han Sun saw the smile, he did not feel good. Just as Han Sun was pulled fully from the bird's nest, Fox Queen's expression became surprised. She waved her jade flute. Dong! A purple knife air roared through the air. It was like a demon coming forward to strike Fox Queen's jade flute. That endless purple knife air slashed the jade flute repeatedly, then struck Fox Queen's body and sent her flying 10 kilometers away. Fox Queen broke the knife air and stood still. Isha's body flashed next to Han Sun, and her phoenix eyes moved to meet Fox Queen's beautiful eyes. Fox Queen felt as if she could feel the spark between them. You are Hansen's teacher? Fox Queen smiled like a flower, but her eyes looked cold. Not bad, Isha answered coldly. Perfect. Han-san said you possess the relic. Give it to me now, and I will let you both walk free, Fox Queen said coldly. Isha responded seriously. I do not recall having a queen like you to obey. Upon hearing those words, Fox Queen looked furious. She swung her jade flute, and some sad sounds came at Isha. As this occurred, she hissed, How dare you? Hansen knew something very bad was about to happen. He didn't say anything, and just maintained his hold on the bird's nest, moving toward the fallen white whale. Two deified beings were now having a fight. Ordinary creatures would not be able to endure the shockwaves. Hansen didn't want to stay there and be reduced to dust. Fortunately, the white whale was ownerless now that Big King Bell had departed. Hansen planned to hide inside and see if he could operate the thing. The white whale could block the attacks of a deified elite. Isha and Fox Queen had been unable to destroy its body. That thing must have been very tough. So if Hansen was able to drive it, the whale would be far greater than a top-class battleship. When Fox Queen came for Hansen, she had given up trying to bind the white whale. The white whale had fallen into the sea, and half of it was just floating atop the surface of the sea. The blood Kirin dove, and took them into the water. Hansen planned on going to the back door and making his way to the white whale's control room. As soon as he entered, he noticed that Crime and Mr. White had followed him. Chapter 2286 Crystallizer Technology Boom. Hansen was about to say something, but a scary sound cut him off. And then, the white whale suddenly flipped and started to sink. Many forces of horrible powers lashed the white whale, and each strike was like the crack of thunder. Fortunately, the big white whale was pretty solid. The shockwaves of combat coming from Isha and Fox Queen were not enough to break the hull. But even so, the impacts were driving it deeper into the sea. Boom! The whale shook under their feet as if it had just hit something. And after that, they heard the sound of something large being destroyed. Then there was only silence. The white whale was no longer being tossed about. Looking out the white whale's eyes, they couldn't see anything except seawater and piles of rock. It looked as if the big white whale had been crushed under an enormous pile of rubble far below the surface. The sea around them was swirling like mad. Even though they were far enough underwater that they could hear the fight overhead, they still saw occasional shockwaves rolling through the water. The turbulence had, however, slowed down a lot. The white whale was now buried by the stone, and it could no longer move. That made Hansen feel better at least. This white whale is a machine. Crime looked around the control room in shock. The revelation had obviously caught him off guard. Mr. White was also looking about the big white whale with interest. Big King Bell, who wasn't the original owner, had been able to control the big white whale. Hansen figured that Mr. White probably could as well. Anyone could control a machine like that, as long as it wasn't locked down. It should work on essentially the same principles as any other machine. Don't move it, Mr. White shouted, just as Hansen was about to move the skeleton on the command chair. Hansen stopped and waited as Mr. White and Crime came to the control deck. What have you learned, Mr. White? Hansen asked politely. Mr. White looked at the skeleton and said, If I understand the situation correctly, this skeleton is the key that makes it possible to control the white whale. Hansen was shocked. He had previously watched Big King Bell jump around on the platform, but he didn't think much of it since the bell was able to control the white whale. But Hansen now saw the thing he had missed earlier. Big King Bell must have used the white whale for a long time, but the bell had never moved the skeleton. There must have been a reason for that. Mr. White, where do you think this technology came from? Hansen asked Mr. White. Mr. White shook his head. This is the first time I have ever come across something like this. I don't know how to control it either. After pausing, Mr. White looked at the skeleton and said, But judging from its clothing, this person must have been connected to the control systems. His remains must be the key to controlling this entire machine. I cannot tell what might happen if we were to remove them. Hansen examined the skeleton's clothes and started thinking. The skeleton's uniform was silver and black, and aside from the head, The entire body was wrapped up tight. It wore a transparent mask that was connected to the uniform. There was no visible seam. Han Sen spent some time observing it, and although he couldn't find a connection between the chair and the uniform, he thought the uniform and the white whale must have been linked somehow. Han Sen activated the purple-eye butterfly to examine the uniform, the platform, and the chair. There were many powerful relics that the purple-eye butterfly could tell Han Sen very little about. But if the item in question was some sort of technology, the purple-eye butterfly was incredibly useful in revealing how it had been made and what its purpose was. When the purple-eye butterfly rewound, Han Sen could see the entire process of the white whale's creation. What he witnessed gave Han Sen quite the surprise. Without a doubt, the white whale was one of the most powerful technologies to ever exist in the entire universe. The process of creating it had been very complicated. It was even harder to build than a deified weapon. It was doubtlessly so complicated because there was a lot of science involved. Every problem that arose with each individual part of the machine had to be solved through science. If Han Sen could analyze every facet of the white whale's technology, leveling up the Alliance's technological advancement would be easy. That wasn't the most shocking thing either. As Han Sen watched the construction of the white whale, he saw the shadow of the beetle. Although the white whale was more advanced than the beetle, the concept of their creation was similar. The white whale was just on a whole new level. The technology of the white whale, in every possible way, far exceeded that of the beetle. Every detail was better than the beetle's too. Is this crystallizer technology? Han Sen wondered in shock. The more he saw of the big white whale, the more accurate his guess seemed to be. Was the technology of the crystallizers ever this good? Could they make machines of a deified level? That's a very frightening idea, Han Sen mused. That would explain why the crystallizers challenged a higher race despite lacking deified elites of their own. Having such technology probably gave them the confidence to start a fight for a lantern. In the end, however, their arrogance and hubris had led to their failure and downfall. As a result, the race was almost entirely destroyed. What a shame! If the crystallizers had challenged a less powerful higher race, they could have definitely claimed a lantern, and then they would have developed even further. They would probably have become one of the top races in the universe. Han Sen sighed, but Han Sen then realized that if the crystallizers had become a higher race, they would have continued to develop their technology. They wouldn't have wanted to change their genes and blood pulse. They might never have experimented with their genes. And if that was so, humans would never have come into existence. Han Sen, you still have the relic, right? Mr. White asked Han Sr. Why are you asking me this? Han Sen looked at Mr. White. Mr. White smiled and said, I left a trace so that you could follow us. And that means I wish to continue our venture of cooperation. Before one of those two wins the fight above us, we should explore the holy town. What made you think I'd catch up with you? Han Sen asked Mr. White with a raised eyebrow. Because I believe in you, Mr. White said gently. Han Sen stared back at Mr. White. Han Sen hadn't believed that the two of them were very close. But Mr. White had just claimed to have an unbelievable amount of faith in him. He gazed into Mr. White's eyes and acknowledged the sincerity within them. This wasn't just another bargain for Mr. White. But for some reason, when Han Sen looked deep into Mr. White's eyes, he had a familiar feeling. It was as if they had already met a long time ago. Chapter 2287 Holy Town Super Gene. That familiar feeling was only present for a single second. When he looked closely at Mr. White again, the man was like a stranger once more. He knew whatever Han Sen might have momentarily felt. Mr. White was of the Extreme King. Han Sen didn't know much about the Extreme King, all in all, and there was no one amongst them that he was actually close with. No one would ever claim that Mr. White was a close friend of his either. Thinking of this, Han Sen considered Mr. White's suggestion. To be honest, Mr. White's suggestion greatly tempted Han Senator after all. Han Sen wasn't entirely sure Isha could defeat Fox Queen in combat. And even if Isha won and continued traveling with him, he would have to share whatever treasure he found with her. They had a good relationship, and they were close enough to practically be considered family. But at the end of the day, their relationship was still built on the foundation that Isha had no clue Han Sun was the almighty dollar. If Isha found out that Han Sun was dollar, there was no telling what she might do. After all, dollar had not been kind to Isha. Han Sun decided to go ahead and explore the sacred leader's treasury with Mr. White. He didn't have to plan out everything in advance. He could betray whoever he needed to whenever he wanted to. He could take any item he required when the time to do so arose. If Han Sun needed to leave these two behind, he would do it without a second thought. It was a very business-like mindset. They were all striving for personal benefit, and they would only cooperate when they needed to use one another. Han Sun needed Mr. White to guide him safely to where the treasure lay. Mr. White needed the relic Han Sun carried. They were both using each other for their own purposes. And when Han Sun found the treasure, even if Han Sun didn't betray them, it was likely that Crime and Mr. White would be the ones betraying him. Of course, the most important thing was that Han Sun would be capable of betraying Mr. White. He just couldn't do that in front of Fox Queen and Isha. We don't have time to wait around. If there is a winner of that battle, neither of us will have the chance to explore that city, Mr. White said to Han. Senator Han Sun went silent. He looked at Mr. White and asked, "You guys destroyed the 4th checkpoint. Did you find anything there?" Han Sun cared about the item in the 4th checkpoint a great deal. There was a high chance that whatever item was retrieved there would prove useful when they reached the treasure. Mr. White went silent, then said, "When Fox Queen destroyed the 36 stone pillars there, she found the jade flute inside the last pillar. That jade flute didn't belong to Fox Queen originally?" Han Sun remembered that Fox Queen had been locked inside Ghost Bone's palace for the longest time. Han Sun had seen no evidence of the flute there, so why would she suddenly possess it now? It made sense that she had gotten it from the 4th checkpoint. But Han Sun was unable to see how the jade flute connected to the other checkpoints and the items they had yielded. Mr. White didn't say anything. He just waited for Han Sun to make a decision. Han Sun was thinking. He used a finger to point at the skeleton in the chair. "This sea seems special." He dived into this deep sea with the intent of reaching its holy town. That is how he became like this in the first place. "I know," Mr. White said simply. "That is why we need the relic you have. It will allow us to reach the holy town safely." "Okay. In that case, we will go and explore the holy town." Han Sun made his mind up. Han Sun didn't know where the holy town was, but Mr. White obviously did. Han Sun followed him in Crime. They left the white whale and dove deeper, going so far under the sea that they reached the deep sea. The sea waves down there were incredibly strong. Clearly Fox Queen and Isha were still engaged in combat. It would take a long time for one of them to emerge victorious. Han Sun wasn't worried about Isha's well-being. With her abilities, even if she was unable to triumph over Fox Queen, he didn't think Fox Queen had what it took to kill Isha. And if Fox Queen couldn't defeat Isha, then he might as well head for the holy town. Han Sun had already learned of a way in which he could commandeer and pilot the white whale. But he saw no reason to use it just yet. Perhaps it would prove useful in the future. With Mr. White's guidance, Han Sun went deeper and deeper. The further they went, the quieter the sea became. The shockwaves Isha and Fox Queen were creating didn't reach those levels. If my calculations are correct, then the sacred leader's treasure should be someplace inside this trench. Mr. White pointed to a large underwater trench in front of him. Han Sun looked down into the trench and saw nothing but darkness. It was like a bottomless abyss. Even using the power of the purple-eye butterfly, he still couldn't see what lurked within. Without too much hesitation though, Mr. White and Crime continued to swim down. Han Sun rode the blood Kirin after them. They all headed into the darkness of the deep trench. A little ways down, Han Sun felt as if something was amiss. The stone plate in his pocket started to burn. Han Sun pulled out the stone plate, and when he did, the plate glowed with a holy light. It lit up a small pocket of brightness amidst the suffocating dark of that place. Just as I thought. Only people who have the relic can enter the place that holds the true treasures of the sacred leader. Mr. White seemed to have expected this, and he eyed the stone plate as he spoke. The three of them, and the beast continued to venture down. The water around them was very dark and creepy. No matter how strong their vision was, they could only see within the small pouch of light that the stone plate provided them. Everything else was pitch black. Nothing else could be seen, as if the entire world had gone black. They didn't know if this was the work of an illusion or not, but Han's son could feel countless eyes peering at them from beyond the black. Time passed. Han's son had no clue how deep they had dived by this point, but the trench was like a bottomless abyss. No matter how deep they went, there appeared to be no end. When he looked up, he found that it was pitch black above him too. The light couldn't penetrate the sea to such depths. They created small waves in the water as they swam, but there was no other movement. Isha and Fox Queen's fight didn't reach them at all anymore, because it was too dark there. Even the blood Kirin started to feel nervous. It kept releasing quiet moans and groans as it swam. Han's son used his hands to stroke the blood Kirin's neck and bring it a bit of comfort. The blood Kirin had always been so moody and angry, and telling him to be quiet would be harder than making him bleed. Mr. White, however, looked calm. Crime was a little nervous, though. It looked like he was feeling the same fear as the blood Kirin. They felt as if they were being watched by phantom eyes in the dark. Hansen knew for sure that something bad lurked out of sight. If it wasn't for his hands holding that relic, their small group would have already ended up like the master of the white whale. Suddenly, it looked like a blurry halo appeared around Hansen's feet in the dark. He focused on that little halo, but the halo was too blurry, and he couldn't see it clearly. Mr. White and Crime also saw the halo. They looked down and checked it out. As their bodies descended, that blurry light became clearer and larger. When Hansen finally got a good look at what was in that halo, he opened his mouth. Chapter 2288 Holy Town. In that strange deep sea, everything around them was pitch black. But at the bottom of the ocean, there was a quiet city lying in the dark. The city was nestled in the darkness like a jewel. It glowed like a beacon of holy light. This underwater town was far different from the one Han's son had seen before. This holy town actually looked like a statue. All the buildings were pieces of a single structure. There were statues that were a few dozen stories high, and every brick was made of jade. The town looked like a jade statue that came from another world. What shocked Han's son the most was the shape of the giant underwater town. The statue was shaped like a sleeping beast with the end of its tail tucked under its head. And the face of the beast startled Han's son badly. The nine-life cat. Han's son almost screamed aloud. The town was shaped just like the nine-life cat pendant Han's son used to own. Aside from the white color of the town, it was just an incredibly large version of the nine-life cat pendant. When Han's son and the others approached the jade town, the town started to look bigger in their eyes. And when they touched the holy light coming from it, the stone plate's light suddenly exploded. Tiny cracks spread across the stone plate. Not long after, the stone plate crumbled away in Hansen's hands, leaving behind a crystal that had rested in the center of the tablet. The crystal was shaped like a water drop, and it rose into the water. It shone with a holy light. It left Hansen's fingers and drifted towards the jade town. Han's son reached his hand out to grab it, but the water drop crystal was too fast for him. Han's son snatched at empty water behind it. The crystal flew towards the cat statue's head. In the nine-life cat's forehead, there was a jade statue. The jade statue looked like a sleeping nine-life cat as well, although a smaller one. That nine-life cat statue's forehead had a water drop slot in it. It looked like the socket of a third eye. The crystal fitted itself perfectly into that water drop-shaped slot. The fit was so tight that it was practically seamless, and the nine-life cat statue suddenly looked complete. It then underwent some weird changes. The sleeping nine-life cat statue suddenly opened its eyes. It laid there lazily for a minute, and its paws moved to run its sleepy-looking cat eyes. It raised its head to look at Han's son and the others floating over the jade town. The three of them wondered if they should enter, but the nine-life cat suddenly raised its paw and waved at them like a lucky cat charm. They felt some irresistible power come upon them. All of them, including the blood Kirin, were then sucked into the jade town, as if by magnetic attraction. They used all their powers to resist the pull, but their efforts were in vain, and they were still pulled down anyway. Pang! 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 Four loud booms rang out as they dropped into the town. They landed in front of a palace that stood before the jade cat statue. "Welcome to Holy Town, you poor guys." The nine-life cat statue was now looking at them from above. Its teeth were bared in something like a smile, but the face didn't seem to possess much mirth. The three of them looked at each other. They didn't know what this was all about, but they made sure to remain alert. They stared at the nine-life cat statue. "Don't be afraid. I am just a guardian spirit that protects the town. I will not hurt any of you." The jade cat still possessed that smile that wasn't actually a smile. Then the tone of its voice changed. "But since you guys are in the holy town, if you cannot pass the tests of the sacred leader, they will probably kill you. Why do we even have to accept your tests?" Crime asked coldly. Despite being a statue, the nine-life cat seemed to have no trouble thinking for itself. It smiled at Crime and said, "It is okay if you don't want to take the test. That means you give up, and you can die right now." Crime frowned. He started to say something more, but Mr. White stopped him. Mr. White looked at the jade cat statue and quietly asked, "What kind of tests are we expected to perform? And if we succeed, what will our rewards be?" The jade cat looked at Mr. White, smiled, and said, "It is simple. Live in the holy town. If you can survive for 10 days, you can win something from the sacred leader's surprise goodie bag. Good luck. Try not to die too soon." After the jade cat statue finished speaking, every palace and room across the town opened its doors. Many scary xenogeniacs began to slowly crawl out of their dens. The blood Kirin's scales straightened up like a dog raising its hackles. Its blood air rose. It growled in warning at the approaching creatures, but the growl warbled slightly, as if the blood Kirin was scared. The xenogeniac beasts acted as if they hadn't heard the blood Kirin at all. All of them emerged from the palace and headed for the plaza. They approached without making any noise. They looked impassively at Han Sun, the blood Kirin, Mr. White, and Crime. So many xenogeniacs had emerged, and they were of a variety Han Sun knew little about. A few of them looked familiar, but even that familiarity was vague and undefined. There was a feathered creature with 6 golden wings, and a Ghana with draconic horns. But most of them were xenogeniacs Han Sun had never seen before. They moved slowly and steadily across the ground. The power of the creatures was overwhelming, and simply sensing their presence made Han Sun feel as if he was shouldering a mountain. A deified thunderbird, a deified sky spirit, a deified 6-winged gold angel, a deified Ghana dragon, Crime screamed. Every name Crime shouted out made Han Sun's heart feel worse and worse. Seeing the creatures had raised a lot of questions for Han Sun, but as Crime spoke, those questions died on his lips. All of the xenogeniac beasts that were walking out of the palaces were deified. How is this possible? Han Sun was floored. There were around 100 of the xenogeniacs circling the plaza. With that many deified xenogeniacs, the entirety of the Geno universe could be conquered. Not even the combined might of the 3 most powerful races could fend off this army. Using such amazing power to conduct a mere test was like using a nuclear bomb to kill a mosquito. Not a mosquito, actually. Perhaps a flea. Or a mite. The combined power of these xenogeniacs could destroy the whole world. This is a trick. It has to be a trick. Maybe some kind of illusion? Sacred cannot have this many deified creatures. And even if they did, the creatures cannot all be here. Han Sun couldn't help but rub his eyes. He summoned his purple eye butterfly to get a proper look at the beings in front of him. And when he did, Han Sun saw enough power to suppress every creature in the entire universe. When these creatures gathered together, they could destroy anything. Those xenogeniac creatures had all the casual power of demon kings. Han Sun suddenly felt like a little girl entering the throne room of hell. He felt weak and vulnerable, while malicious eyes watched him from the dark. Chapter 2289 Test. Han Sun wondered if Sacred Leader had played a joke on them. They were surrounded by so many deified xenogeniacs, And Han Sun had just recently become a duke. Not even the deified elites that Han Sun knew would have stood a chance against all the powerful xenogeneics that had gathered. It's a trap. Han Sun couldn't think of any way he could fight off the amount of power that had been arrayed against him. Even if he refined 13 deified blood pulses, he would only gain their blood pulse abilities. His own level wouldn't ascend to deified status, and he would still most likely be killed. On top of that, he didn't have the time to refine another 12 deified blood pulses. Is the Jade Flute in Fox Queen's hands the key to getting through this? Perhaps there is a song that can be played to soothe and lull all of the deified xenogeneics. It might subdue them without the need for fighting at all, Han Sun thought. It was pointless since they didn't have the flute though. Mr. White and Crime were just as shocked by the situation they had found themselves in. There was no way for them to run. They were surrounded by too many powerful xenogeneics. Even if the ruler of the Extreme King came personally to save them, it wouldn't do any good. All of those scary creatures gathered in the plaza, and it became quite crowded as they filed in. The creatures watched the small group, and the weight of those eyes put fear into Han Sun, and even Mr. White. The deified xenogeneics drew closer, pushing Han Sun and the others toward the center of the palace. There was no way to withdraw, and suddenly the Jade Cat coughed twice. Cough, cough. After the Jade Cat coughed, the deified xenogeneics halted their advance. They did not get any closer to Han Sun, but they did not walk away either. They simply remained where they were, staring expressionlessly at Han Sun's group. The Jade Cat looked at Han Sun and smiled. Don't be afraid. They will not attack you just yet. You guys have 1 day to travel anywhere in this city you desire. For this 1 day, they will not be permitted to bring you any harm. If you guys are still alive after 10 days, then you will have passed the test. We'll be hounded by 100 deified xenogeneics. How are we expected to survive 10 whole days inside the city? Han Sun wanted to bargain for some better terms. The Jade Cat smiled. They are not really deified xenogeneics. They are just the clones of deified xenogeneics that Sacred Leader created. Each of them can only unleash a single deified attack. After one attack, they will die. So you guys still have a minuscule chance of surviving. Try your best. Oh, and right, I forgot to tell you guys. If you get into a fight with a deified xenogeneic clone, the others will back off. Only one can attack you at a time. The others won't interfere. Right. The test starts now. Try your best to survive. You have 1 full day to hide. You can hide anywhere you wish inside the holy town. The Jade Cat statue laid down after speaking, settling itself, as if it was sleeping again. It looked like an ordinary jade statue. Han Sun could no longer sense any life force in it. Han Sun tried asking it a few more questions, but the Jade Cat statue did not respond. All that was left were the scary deified xenogeneic clones looking at them. Let's go. We only have 1 day. This is our 1 chance of surviving, Mr. White said. Then he stepped into the crowd of xenogeneics. The scary deified xenogeneics clones parted to form a path for him. The creatures wouldn't stop them from leaving. Han Sun followed Mr. White out of the plaza. 100 scary deified xenogeneics watched them walk away, but none of the creatures chased after them. Mr. White, do you have a plan that can help us escape this predicament? Han Sun asked. Mr. White shook his head. I am fairly sure that exiting the holy town is out of the question, to be honest with you. The only way we can get through the next 10 days is to hide somewhere that the deified clones cannot find us. But I doubt that the Sacred Leader created a game of hide and seek out of boredom. He must have some other purpose here. So no matter where we hide, we can be sure that the xenogeneics will find us. Sir, what are you saying? Should we hide or should we not hide? Crime asked with confusion. Mr. White had described the results of both options, and neither one sounded good. Han Sun laughed. Mr. White explained it so clearly. We need to hide for 10 days, but even so, we will be found. That suggests that there is only 1 way in which we can hide. And what way is that? Crime still didn't understand. Han Sun had no choice but to explain. Did the Jade Cat statue not tell you clearly enough? If we are fighting 1 xenogeneic, the others will leave us alone until the fight is finished. So we need to fight 1 soul xenogeneic for all 10 days. If we do that, the other Xenogenics might as well not even exist. I see. But how do we engage just one Xenogenic for that long? Didn't the Jade Cat statue say that the deified Xenogenics here are cloned? After one strike, their bodies will break, Crime asked. That is something you will have to ask Mr. White about. Mr. White came up with the plan first. I am sure he's already thought of contingencies. Han-sun looked at Mr. White. I do have a few ideas, but ensuring our survival over the next 10 days will require the four of us to cooperate. Mr. White explained his plan. When Han-sun and Crime heard it, they thought the suggestion was way too risky. However, they couldn't think of any alternative courses of action, so they agreed to do it. The four of them didn't leave the plaza to hide. They tried to leave Holy Town just to see if they could. But after that, they went back to the plaza. Their day of waiting seemed to drag on and on. They could have spent the time hiding deep within the town, but they all knew that it would have been a pointless exercise. No matter how big Holy Town was, it was still just a town. The deified Xenogenics could use the power of their minds to scour the entire town for their prey. There were more than 100 deified Xenogenics there, so finding Han-sen's group would be easy. Mr. White's plan relied on using their single day of peace to prepare. What came next would be simple. Mr. White would familiarize himself with one of the deified Xenogenics, taking advantage of the creature's temporary docility to use his sealing techniques on it. Once he had sealed the deified clone's power, it wouldn't be able to use its deified strike. That way, they could draw out the fight to last for the entire 10 days. The deified Xenogenic would still be exceptionally strong, of course. Although only one strike needed to be sealed, it was a deified power. Mr. White could not seal the power by himself. He needed the combined might of Han-sun, the Blood Kirin, and Crime to help him complete the seal. The three of them resigned themselves to the plan. As long as they didn't attack the other deified clones, the clones would just stand there in the plaza and stare at them. Remember, my 4-symbol seal requires 4 people to function. So once the sealing begins, none of you can move. You have to keep sending power into the seal. If we lose anyone's power, the seal will break, Mr. White said seriously. Then he sent a wave of energy into Han-sun, Crime, and the Blood Kirin. Strange, new symbols of light appeared on their hands. Chapter 2294 Symbols. Seal. The light symbol hummed on Han-sun's hand, like an energy converter. When Han-sun sent power into the light symbol, his energy was transformed into sealing power. Green dragon, white tiger, red bird and black turtle. 4 beasts made up the symbols, and Han-sun was represented by the red bird. As his power flowed into the symbol swirled around in his hand like a flaming bird. Mr. White stepped in front of one Xenogenic clone and directed Han-sun, Crime, and the Blood Kirin to stand on either side of and behind the creature. This was a powerful seal that normally required many people to do what they were attempting to. It wouldn't be an easy task in the midst of combat, that was for sure. Usually, a person would use this technique to seal a creature that was already under their control. The technique took far too long to be useful in a fight. Fortunately, the Xenogenic clone wasn't going to attack them during their free day. It stood there unmoving, increasing their chances of sealing it successfully. The first attempt went smoothly. Han-sun and the others surrounded the Xenogenic from 4 different directions. They weren't attacked, and the Xenogenic simply stood there looking at them. Mr. White waved at Han-sun and the others, indicating they should rest a little. It was still early in the day after all. If they fully committed to the sealing right then, they'd be wasting some of their strength. They needed to seal the creature at the last moment possible, in order to save every smidgen of energy they had. After a minute of thought, Han-sun said, "Since they aren't attacking us now, why don't we at least try the sealing to see if it works?" "You don't trust Mr. White? Even if the seal doesn't work, do you have another way out of this?" Crime asked in a cold voice. "There is nothing wrong with giving it a try," Han-sun responded flatly. Mr. White nodded. "Okay, then let us try. It will be a useful practice run." Following Mr. White's command, Han-sun and the others cast the 4-symbol seal. The symbol of the red bird shivered on Han Sen's hand. He felt a connection form between the bird and Mr. White's white tiger, Crime's black turtle, and the green dragon that hovered around the blood Kirin's claws. All those powers were transferred, and the four symbol seal's light became stronger. The connection between them strengthened. The four powers supported each other, and as the light rose, four giant shadows formed into a bysema that trapped the creature inside. The xenogeniac found itself confined within the bysema. Its eyes flashed, and the enemy started to move. "Oh no! It is going to attack us! Seal the bysema now!" Mr. White shouted loudly. The four of them quickly finished casting the four symbols seal. The shadows of the green dragon, the white tiger, the red bird, and the black turtle were cast onto the xenogeniac's body. The shadows bound the xenogeniac. The xenogeniac kept moving as Han Sen, and the others continued casting their seal. The four shadows kept seething across the xenogeniac. The xenogeniac tried to fight back, but it couldn't break the seal. Crime looked ill, and he said, "I told you to trust Mr. White, but you just had to try it. Now we've wasted so much more of our power. What's done is done. We will just have to hold the seal and keep it going for the next 10 days, Mr. White said firmly, putting an end to Crime's complaining. Han Sen shrugged slightly and remained silent. He had known this was a possibility, but he thought they should give it a try anyway. Attempting the seal now would only anger one xenogeniac. If it failed, only one powerful creature would be trying to kill them. But if they failed closer to the end of the first day, they might end up being attacked by whole groups of the monsters. So, Han Sen would rather spend a bit more energy now than risk everything later on. Aside from the struggling xenogeniac in the seal, the other xenogeniacs just maintained their stances and their expressionless stares. When Han Sen's group confirmed that they weren't going to be attacked by the monsters around them, they felt greatly relieved. The xenogeniac kept struggling. Although its power was sealed, it still had a deified body. Han Sen and the others had to use all their power to hold the seal against the raw, physical strength of the creature's thrashing. Mr. White and the Blood Kirin were half deified, so they had an easier time. Crime was a top dog of the kings, so he was holding up well too. But Han Sen had only just become a duke. He hadn't been a duke for very long, so his power was lacking in comparison to the others. He had to use all of his strength just to keep the red bird symbol of light up. Mr. White looked at Han Sen and said, "A duke's element is separate from your original body's astral body and celestial body. Your original body is your own genes taking the form of an element. At that stage, you must use your own power to fight. At the second stage, your astral body needs to rely on the planet beneath you. Planetary powers can be used to aid the elements of your body. For instance, a water element duke will perform much better on a water-based planet." After pausing, Mr. White continued to say, "The celestial body you can access in the third stage is also known as your universal body. That body can use the power of the universe. As long as it is not separated from the universe for some reason, it has access to practically unlimited power." Han Sen understood what Mr. White was talking about, but he had only just become a duke. He only had his original body, so he couldn't make use of any external powers. Plus, even if he did gain a celestial body, he knew that Holy Town was separated from the outside world. He couldn't access any power that was outside the town. Mr. White knew what Han Sen was thinking, and so he smiled. "Judging by the way you use your body, you must still be at the first stage. You only have your original body. I have an original body geno-art that might be able to help you. Perhaps you could learn it in order to ascend more easily. If you are really willing to teach me, I would be very grateful." Han Sen was surprised. He hadn't expected Mr. White to volunteer to teach him a geno-art, and he wasn't sure what the sudden offer meant. "Mr. White, why do you care about him?" Crime exclaimed unhappily. Mr. White smiled. "We are cooperating to maintain the seal, aren't we? We are all in this together. Han Sen is of a lower level than us, so he will have a hard time over the course of the next 10 days. If anything happens to him, we will all be destroyed. I am only doing this for myself." After Mr. White said that, Crime fell silent. Mr. White paused for a moment before speaking. My Geno art isn't very impressive. I made it myself, and I never did think up a name for it. It hasn't been presented anywhere. I'll explain it as best I can, and if you think it helps, you can use it. If it doesn't, that's okay. Please tell me, Han-sun said. In a quiet voice, Mr. White gave a straightforward explanation of the Geno art. Crime and the blood Kirin focused on his words as well. Crime listened seriously. Just like Mr. White said, his Geno art seemed rather simple. Even so, it was obviously quite special. Despite its simplicity, it was incredibly difficult to understand. Mr. White, your Geno art is so complicated. I am afraid he won't be able to understand it, Crime said after hearing Mr. White's Geno art. Chapter 2291 Small Surprise. I don't think I really understand. Please explain it to me again, Han-sun said, trying to keep his shock from showing on his face. Truthfully, Han-sun understood the Geno art perfectly. The Geno art was quite familiar to him, and that familiarity shook him to his core. The Geno art had an obvious connection to the Dongxian Sutra. Both arts could benefit each other quite well, and using Mr. White's technique could aid in the development of the Dongxian Sutra. Han-sun could use the Dongxian Sutra to absorb power from the world around him. Doing so allowed him to conserve his own energy, stretching his strength out over a longer period of time. But the Dongxian Sutra had yet to reach Duke, so the effect wasn't particularly good. It only saved Han-sun a small amount of power. Has Mr. White realized that I used the Dongxian Sutra? Is that why he's telling about this Geno art? What is he planning? Han-sun thought fast, but he didn't have enough information to guess what Mr. White was playing at. It seemed likely that Mr. White knew that Han-sun could use the Dongxian Sutra. Explaining a Geno art as simply as he had suggested that the man's mind was quite frightening. It put Han-sun on red alert. If you don't mind me repeating myself, I will recite the Geno art again. Mr. White smiled. Then he resumed talking about the Geno art. It would have been better if he had stopped speaking there, for the more he talked, the more confused Crime became. Mr. White's detailed explanation of the Geno art was more difficult to understand than the Geno art itself. He began speaking about the Geno universe itself, which was something Crime had never heard about before. Han-sun used the Dongxian aura to listen, and he was able to understand a bit. He pretended that he couldn't though, and he feigned confusion. Mr. White, I'm afraid that the explanation isn't helping. I am just getting more and more confused. Han-sun presented Mr. White with a wry smile. Mr. White is so smart. Since you're just a duke, well, it is only expected that you can't understand a word that he's saying. And don't worry, I don't understand either. It isn't about you, okay? Crime said. Mr. White shook his head and sighed. The things I have learned are a bit different from your own Geno art. It is okay that you don't understand, but try to learn as much as you can, for I can only explain it here like this. Thank you for your willingness to teach me. I'm just afraid I will never be able to learn such a Geno art, Han-sun said. But he was secretly casting the Geno art Mr. White had just taught him. He gave it a try, and it worked fine. When Han-sun didn't summon his Dongxian armor, the effect of absorbing external power seemed to increase. And this was Han-sun's very first time using the ability. If the ability was already useful, then it would surely become a greater and greater benefit to him, as his proficiency increased. Han-sun still didn't know why Mr. White had given him the Geno art, but he was okay with learning something new. Han-sun practiced it, and the strain of maintaining the four-symbol seal decreased. The day went by pretty quickly. After the first 24 hours, the other deified xenogeneic clones shifted slightly toward Han-sun, and the others like the very hungry monsters that they were. The monsters stared at them for a whole day, and the beasts' eyes were different than they had been. There was a fresh, murderous gleam in their eyes. The scary creatures looked over them, as if deciding which flavor of meat to dine on first. The slavering beasts made Han-sun and the others nervous. But even so, despite all the attention directed toward them, not a single one of the xenogeneics prepared to attack. They just stared at Han-sun's group like jewels. Acknowledging their apparent safety, Han-sun and the others felt relieved. It was fortunate that the jade cat statue hadn't lied to them. The deified clones really were restraining themselves, as the cat statue had said. Han Sen and the others didn't dare move though. They continued using their strength to keep the Bysema going. They kept the deified xenogeneic clone sealed, hoping they could hold the creature there for the entire 10 days. But as time ticked by, the xenogeneic clone's struggling became worse and worse. After it had been thrashing around for a while, Han Sen started to feel a strain. 5 days later, even the half-deified blood Kirin was beginning to fatigue. Because each part of the four-symbol seal was connected, Han Sen didn't have to continually use his full power. It meant that the others had to pick up his weight, though, to keep the deified xenogeneic suppressed. So the blood Kirin and Mr. White were using up a lot more power than Han Sen was. Sweat began to trickle down Crime's forehead. It was getting hard for him too. Things were not going as well as they had hoped. But by Han Sen's estimation, if they continued using power at the same rate, they would survive all 10 days of the trial. Little guys, you seem to be working very hard. I have to say, you're not doing a bad job. Suddenly, the jade cat statue started talking again. It spoke lazily though, as if it had just woken up from a deep slumber. Han Sen and the others were concentrating all their strength on maintaining the four symbols seal, however. They couldn't spare the time or effort to bother looking in the direction of the jade cat statue. The jade cat statue's voice came from behind them again. You guys are doing good. But don't you think that this would be a boring way to pass the test? You aren't going to cheat, are you? Han Sen's heart jumped. If the jade cat statue let the rest of the xenogeneics attack them, they would be very dead. The jade cat statue laughed and said, "Don't worry. I cannot change the rules that sacred leaders set in place. I just wanted to give you a small surprise." "I hate surprises," Han Sen said with a tight feral smile. "But this really is a surprise. It might actually prove to be a great benefit to you guys. Of course, you will need to have what it takes to accept the surprise." The jade cat statue looked as if it was smiling, but it wasn't. After the cat statue's voice trailed off, Han Sen heard a noise coming from the ground. It sounded like something was dragging metal chains. Han Sen scanned around them with his Dongxian aura, and then he noticed as all the deified clones began stepping away from them. Something new was approaching Han Sen's group. It was a skeleton, or at least it looked like a skeleton. The flesh of the creature had dried into a withered husk. Its long hair was like tufts of hay. The being wasn't dead though. His limbs were bound by metal cuffs, and he walked very slowly. With every step the man took, chains grated across the ground behind him. The chained man was approaching them with his head lowered. When he got closer, Han Sen could see that there were 2 dark holes where his eyes should have been. Dark blood wept from the holes, and the eyes were missing. Han Sen and the others looked grim. They were using their powers to cast the four symbols seal. If the creepy man attacked them, they wouldn't be able to block the strike without releasing the four symbols seal. And that would be enough to lead to their doom. The prisoner came within 10 meters of them, chains rasping across the ground with every step. He raised his head so that the 2 bloody holes could peer at Han Sen and the others. Those 2 holes gave them the willies. He stopped for a moment, but then the prisoner started to move again. His slow steps took him toward Han Sr. What the fuck? Han Sen thought frantically. There were 4 of them. But the prisoner had decided to go for Han Senator. It was getting closer. And after another minute, it stood right behind him. Chapter 2292. The prisoner at the rear. The prisoner approached Han Senator, although he walked slowly. He was already very close to them. A second later, he was directly behind Han Senator as the prisoner walked. His cuffs clinked and clanked. When he came to a stop behind Han Sen, he fell completely silent. Han Sen couldn't even hear the prisoner breathing or his heart beating. It was as if he no longer existed. Han Sen used his Dongxian aura to scan the prisoner, but he was shocked to find that he could no longer detect the prisoner's presence. Goosebumps flared across Han Sen's body. The prisoner was standing directly behind him, but he could not feel the strange chained man. His inability to detect the creature deeply unsettled Han Senator. He wanted to just run away as fast as he could. But he was currently casting the red bird spell. If he left his position, then the 4-symbol seal would break. If any of the 4 tried to run, they'd all end up dead. The bird's nest still sat on Han Sen's head. He forced himself not to turn around, and he thought to himself, "So what if you are behind me? You can't break this bird's nest. I have nothing to be afraid of." Han Sen stood where he was and did not move. He did not dare turn and look behind him. He continued to cast his powers through the red bird spell to keep the trapped xenogeniac suppressed. But when Han Sen looked at Mr. White and the others, he was given a shock. Mr. White's face looked strange, but Han Sen couldn't accurately read the man's expression. Crime's expression was easier to interpret though. He was in massive shock. He stared behind Han Sen with wide eyes, as if he had seen a ghost. The Blood Kirin's response was even more dramatic. It was growling at Han Sen, as if in an urgent warning. "What is he doing behind me?" Han Sen's heart felt chilled. He still couldn't detect the presence behind him. It was as if the chained man wasn't actually a creature at all, but some specter of death itself. Mr. White gulped. He looked pale, but still, he didn't say a word. His expression made Han Sen even more worried. Han Sen could no longer help it, so he moved his head to take a look. He couldn't turn his head very far though, because if he moved his hands or body, he could disrupt the casting. After twisting his head to the left, he saw nothing. Then he looked right, and still he couldn't see anything. Han Sen wished he could just twist his body around, so he could properly see what the prisoner was doing. But he really couldn't move his body. Han Sen couldn't keep his eyes off the others' horrified expressions though. Their vision lingered on the space behind Han Sen, which made his heart tremble in fear. "Fuck you. I have a bird's nest to protect me, and I have nothing to be afraid of." Han Sen gritted his teeth and did not move. But suddenly, Han Sen felt a chill run down his neck. It felt as if something was blowing a cold breath over his neck. Han Sen's skin prickled as his back turned sore, and his legs went soft. Han Sen had seen many scary things in his lifetime, so he didn't frighten easily. But not being able to see the prisoner was deeply disturbing. He felt a deep chill in his heart. "Don't move," Mr. White called to Han Sr. "What is he doing behind me?" Han Sen asked, his voice tense. It was a shame that the Blood Kirin couldn't speak. If it had been able to talk, Han Sen would have asked it. Crime wasn't trustworthy enough for Han Sen to bother asking him though. "This is hard to explain." Mr. White frowned, and he looked poorly. It seemed as if he didn't know what to say. Seeing Mr. White's hesitation made Han Sen frown. He had no clue what was going on behind him. If Han Sen was in danger, Crime and Mr. White probably wouldn't want to tell him, because they wouldn't want to risk Han Sen moving and breaking the 4-symbol seal. However, Han Sen didn't think that was the reason for their behavior. If Han Sen was attacked and wounded, then the 4-symbol seal would break anyway. They wouldn't stay silent and tell him not to move. If there is no actual danger, then why can they not tell me what's wrong? Han Sen wondered. Han Sen's attempts to figure out what was happening were getting him nowhere, but his back felt colder and colder. His worry continued to deepen. Mr. White and Crime were still staring at the space behind him. The Blood Kirin kept growling at Han Sen, as if it wished to tell him something. Han Sen could no longer resist the temptation. He summoned Bauer and asked her to take a look at the prisoner behind him. Bauer appeared on Han Sen's shoulder. Han Sen spoke to her. "Bauer, help your daddy take a look at what this thing is doing behind him." Bauer nodded. She leaned over his shoulder and took a look behind him. She jerked in surprise and said, "Dad, behind you. What is behind me?" Han Sen quickly asked. "There is a man drawing on your back," Bauer said after thinking. "Drawing?" Han Sen's mind went blank for a minute. He was confused, and so he thought, "The prisoner is drawing something on my back? Is he an artist? Does he love drawing on humans? Is my body too good, and he could not help but use my fine figure for a canvas? No way. If he was fond of drawing on bodies, then he should have gone and found a pretty girl to paint upon. Why bother drawing on me?" "Bauer, what is he drawing?" Han Sen quickly asked. Something else had to be going on here. Bauer leaned further over Han Sen's shoulder, peering at Han Sen's back, but she didn't speak. "Bauer, what is he drawing?" Han Sen squeaked. He wasn't scared, he told himself. He just didn't like it. Bauer hesitated, but she eventually said, It's like the creature is drawing a person. Yeah, a woman. A woman? What kind of woman? Han-sun was frozen. A skeletal prisoner had appeared out of nowhere, slinked up to his back, and started drawing a woman on him. This was too fucking creepy, and it made Han-sun feel itchy and uncomfortable. Bauer didn't seem to know how she might describe what she saw. With hesitation she said, An ugly, ugly woman. Han-sun felt his pulse pounding in his temples. An ugly prisoner was now drawing an ugly woman on his back. What the fuck was happening? Han-sun's mouth was wide open. He tried to ask another question, but he had no idea what he should ask. Bauer observed his back some more, and then she said, Dad, he cannot draw anymore. Why? Han-sun asked curiously. Bauer responded quickly this time. The blood of the woman coming from his hands is running dry, and there is no more paint left. What? He is using a woman's blood to draw on my back? Han-sun felt as if his head was going to explode. He could not imagine the scene behind him. Chapter 2293 Passing the test. Dad. The woman has no more blood. Dad. He cracked open the woman's brain. Bauer kept reporting what was happening. Bauer, stop looking. Han-sun called Bauer back into his arms. He didn't want her to see such a bloody scene. Bauer was actually quite old at this point, but in Han-sun's eyes, she'd be a little girl forever. Bauer jumped off of Han-sun's shoulder to sit on his chest. She looked curiously at the four-symbol seal, and the trapped xenogeniac that was still struggling inside. Han-sun still couldn't feel anything behind him, but after hearing what Bauer had said, he felt sick with worry. The images of what she had described kept repeating inside his mind, and nothing he tried to think about could scrub them away. Jade Cat, what are you doing? Han-sun finally shouted at the statue of the Jade Cat. The Jade Cat already seemed to be sleeping again, and it showed no reaction to Han-sun's call. After a while, the prisoner's chains began to rattle again. As it left the space behind Han-sun's back, it slowly entered his field of vision. The prisoner left in pretty much the same manner that he arrived, slowly and seemingly vacant-minded. There was one small difference, however. He was dragging the corpse of a woman behind him. To be more accurate, that was not the body of a woman. It was a female creature's body. Han-sun couldn't see what the female creature's facial features had been, because a large hole had been punched into the creature's head. There was a gaping cavity where the face had been. The upper part of her body was humanoid, though, and the lower body was like a snake. She looked like one of the Ghana, but unlike the Ghana, there was a spiraling horn on her head. It was silver and around 1 foot long, and it was reminiscent of a unicorn's horn. The snake scales of her lower body were silver as well. They were so bright that they made her form seem a little transparent. Holes had been torn through her head and chest, but there was no blood oozing out. It was just as Bauer had originally said, in that the blood of the woman had run dry. What is that weirdo's presence here supposed to mean? Why would he draw a woman on my back? Han-sun wondered, somewhat shaken. But Han-sun didn't seem to be injured or impaired. His body was fine. His galactic lobster armor was fine. And it looked like the creepy prisoner guy was leaving now that he had drawn his picture. Although the whole experience had been rather disturbing, the creature hadn't actually hurt him. So, Han-sun knew he'd just have to stop thinking about it. Bauer, could you use some water to wash your dad's armor? Wash away the mess he made, Han-sun said to Bauer. While the paint hadn't been harmful, he was still unhappy to have it on him. Bauer jumped off of Han-sun's chest and walked behind him to do as he asked. Then her surprised voice said, She is gone. What is gone? Han-sun's heart jumped into his throat. The picture he drew is now gone, Bauer said. How could it be gone? Han-sun was very confused about this, and so he proceeded to ask, Did the picture just get smeared? Bauer shook her head. Dad, there's nothing on your back. It is very clean, and there is not even the smallest semblance of a bloodstain. The ugly woman drawing is all gone. Han-sun had no idea what to make of this, so he asked Mr. White. Mr. White, what is going on? Mr. White shook his head. I don't understand any of this either. We couldn't see your back, and we were only able to see that he was drawing something on you. I don't know what it was that he actually drew. Han Sen didn't like not knowing, but there was little that he could do about it. He checked his body and noted how nothing seemed to have happened, so for now, he shelved all thoughts about it. Nothing strange happened after that. The four of them kept sending power into the four symbols seal. It maintained a firm hold on the snared xenogeneic clone. Days passed, and after what felt like forever, they reached the 10-day deadline. Although the four of them were quite exhausted by this point, they had at least managed to survive the 10 days. When the xenogeneics returned to their palace lairs, and the doors of their palaces closed, the four of them almost collapsed. The jade cat statue smiled and began speaking again. Congratulations! You have passed the sacred leader's test. You can now receive the relic left behind by the sacred leader. Where is the treasure? Han Sen asked, forcing himself to ignore his exhaustion. Right here, the jade cat statue said. The jade pillar below its feet then suddenly opened up, revealing a small jade box. It was impossible to guess what might lay inside. Han Sen started forward to pick up the box, but then, his heart jumped up. He saw that Crime was holding a broken sword, slashing towards Han. Senator the Blood Kirin was angered by this, and so it roared and leaped towards Crime. But Crime's darkness covered everything, and Han Sen's eyes were unable to pierce it. Han Sen didn't move his eyes though. The bird's nest was still on his head, and he leaped towards where the box had been before everything went black. In Crime's area of effect, all 7 of Han Sen's senses were blocked. But because he had the protection of the bird's nest, he wasn't concerned about any attacks that Crime might launch. But the next second, Han Sen's face changed. A weird power came down to strike the bird's nest. The power locked onto the bird's nest and pulled it away from Han Sen's head. Then, he and Bauer were tied up by something like a rope. The rope jerked them roughly to the side. The darkness faded. Han Sen noticed that he and Bauer were now bound by loop upon loop of white rope. Next to them, there was a net with Han Sen's bird's nest inside it. The net must have been quite special, if it was able to bind a deified bird's nest. Crime held the net in one hand, and the jade box in the other. Thank you for helping me obtain the sacred leader's treasure, Crime said coldly to Han Sen, holding the box casually under one arm. Who are you? Mr. White frowned at Crime. Crime smiled and said, Mr. White, I am your faithful guard Crime. You look like Crime, but Crime is just a king-class guard. You most certainly aren't. Crime wouldn't possess Prince 14's sky net, Mr. White stated flatly, his frown deepening. Crime slid the box into his chest pocket. Then, he lifted his broken knife and spoke to Mr. White. You think too much. Although I am half deified, I am still your guard. But aside from you, I have a duty to Prince 14 as well. Prince 14 wants this item, so I will have to take this back with me. Mr. White, we both work for Prince 14. You have helped me a great deal, and I will tell Prince 14 of your involvement. But this is not where this should be discussed. We need to get rid of him first, Crime said. Then his broken knife came swinging towards Han Sr. Chapter 2294 Getting the treasure. Crime swung his weapon, and the substance chain on his knife became a black snake king that looked as if it could swallow the sky. It suddenly lashed towards Han. Senator Han Sen's body surged with power, but the white rope tightened around him. The mysterious substance chain tangled him up, and it made it difficult for Han Sen to gather up any semblance of defense. That knife was going to slice him to ribbons. Han Sen gritted his teeth. He was preparing to activate his super god spirit mode when the roaring knife light was broken. Han Sen was shocked. He looked at Crime. A hand that looked like jade had wrapped around Crime's wrist. The fingers were very long and pretty. Mr. White. Han Sen could not believe what his own eyes were seeing. Mr. White was standing behind Crime, pulling his hand back through Crime's chest. But Mr. White's hand emerged perfectly clean, without a speck of blood dirtying it. Crime's broken knife fell to the ground. He looked at the bloody hole in his chest, and then looked at Mr. White with disbelief. He said, Your power was said to be useless in a fight. How were you able to destroy my black lion body? Life is full of surprises. You should have gotten used to that by now. A beautiful white shell appeared in Mr. White's hand. He opened it and held it out toward Crime. The injured Crime was sucked into the shell. Visit website our list novel. Calm. When the shell closed up, Mr. White pocketed it. He grabbed the sky net and the little box. He looked as if he was smiling, but he wasn't. And to Han-sun he said, Han-sun, it looks like you have lost completely. Han-sun was still bound by the sky net. He gave Mr. White a wry smile. You won. So, what are you going to do with me? Kill you, of course. Do you really think I'd let a scary enemy like you continue to live and grow in this world? Mr. White looked at Han-sun emotionlessly. Mr. White, you overestimate me. I am just a nameless soldier. Han-sun didn't move. He summoned all his power. As he continued to stare at Mr. White, he was going to take a risk. Mr. White turned to the cat statue as he gripped the sky net, ignoring Han-sun and Bauer. 9-life cat, can we go now? Han-sun was shocked. Mr. White knew the jade cat statue was a 9-life cat. The 9-life cat statue stared at Mr. White. It remained unmoving as it coldly said, If you guys passed the test, so it is entirely up to you whether you come or go. There is no need to ask for my permission. Goodbye. Mr. White tugged the sky net and dragged Han-sun and Bauer out of Holy Town. This time, the power of the town didn't prevent them from leaving. Mr. White pulled Han-sun and Bauer out of the town with ease and returned to that area of dark water. Mr. White's other hand glowed with holy light as it held the jade stone box. The light was able to keep the darkness at bay, at a distance of around 3 meters from them. He eventually pulled Bauer and Han-sun safely out of the trench. Han-sun had thought Mr. White would kill them in Holy Town, but he didn't. And after he left that place, he didn't try to make a quick getaway. He took Han-sun and Bauer into the big white whale instead. Fox Queen and Isha's fight seemed to have ended, since there was no more movement in the sea. It was unclear which of the two might have emerged victorious though. There was no sign of either of them. Mr. White brought Han-sun and Bauer into the big white whale. He smiled and looked at Han Sr. Now I can kill you without any worries. Have you thought up any escape ideas? Why didn't you kill me in Holy Town? Han-sun asked with confusion. You really think that town hid the real treasure? Mr. White asked in an amused tone. It didn't. Han-sun asked. It could have, but only if the sacred leader went mad. It would have taken utter insanity to spend so much power and effort constructing a place to hide his own treasure. Mr. White smiled. This place must have a secret that you haven't even imagined yet. Aside from that, the picture on your back looks pretty special. I thought the drawing was gone. Han-sun was shocked. Mr. White laughed and said, You are too naive. Just because something disappears, that doesn't mean it is gone. I didn't recognize the person who drew on you, but I do know that he was drawing a creature known as Ancient Blood Dragon Lady. It is a mutant deified xenogeneic. Her blood is her mutant xenogeneic gene. I don't think such powerful blood could disappear so easily. Han-sun heard this and was shocked. He had never thought that thing might have been a mutant deified creature. Why? Why did he draw on me? Han-sun asked in confusion. I do not know. Perhaps ever since the beginning, you were the chosen one. Mr. White's expression hardened. But it doesn't matter anymore. I am going to kill you, so everything will end. After that, Mr. White looked angry. He yanked the sky net, and Han-sun and Bauer were pulled in front of him. His hand reached out to grab Han. Senator Han-sun remembered how Crime's body was easily perforated by Mr. White's hand. He was shocked, and he was about to activate his super god body. But when Mr. White waved his hand, the sky net loosened enough to release the bird's nest. The bird's nest returned to Han Sr. Mr. White, this is... Han-sun caught the bird's nest, and he looked at Mr. White with confusion. Mr. White put away the sky net, and he tossed the jade box towards Han. Senator Han-sun caught the little jade box, his confusion growing. He had no idea what was going on. Mr. White smiled at Han. Senator. His muscles and bones began to shift and writhe, and so too did his face. Not long after, Mr. White became someone else. His presence was greatly changed. Mr. White now looked younger. He looked no more than 20 years old, but his body carried a special sort of presence. It gave Han-sun the feeling that this man had seen and lived through everything. He was like a person that oversaw a match of chess. Han Sen's mouth opened wide. You? How is it you? Han Sen screamed, pointing at him. Why would it not be me? Mr. White looked at Han Sen with interest. Aren't you in the sanctuaries? How? How did you get out? Han Sen spoke only half of what he wished to. He then suddenly thought of Blood Legion and the Shura, who both had a way to leave. It now didn't seem so strange that this person had been able to leave the sanctuaries. It is a long story. To summarize, I thought I'd be able to break the vacuum and become a god in this world. But who knew that this was the place I would actually come to? It was quite a disappointment all in all. Mr. White shrugged, looking regretful. I cannot believe it. Han Sen mumbled, still frozen. Han Sen knew this man. They hadn't spent much time together, but Han Sen remembered him. That was because this man was the real heir of the Xian men. But Han Sen had only learned the Dongxian Sutra from Dong Xianzi. That counted for half of the Xian men students. You're tuning in to the Li Mei's Wuxia Whispers YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.